Excellent. They're just horrible people. That's all. That's all it is, Sean. Chemists are horrible, horrible people who couldn't get real jobs, don't have real lives. They're just horrible, horrible people. All right, excellent. Okay, so again, if you have not done so already, please take the attendance quiz. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you do, you're taking the attendance quiz is your way of showing me that you are here, allows you to stay enrolled in the class, allows you to be able to add the class. So please take that. The access code is LOCK, L-O-C-K, all lowercase. Make sure that you do that and do that soon. We've got a busy day ahead of us. We're going to continue the rest of our introduction to anatomy and physiology, talking about our first major physiological process. Loving chemistry costs you 2 points of participation. So I'm taking 2 points of participation points from you for loving chemistry. And because it's a horrible, horrible thing. So we'll finish our introduction, talk about our first major physiological process, and then we will talk a little chemistry because it's necessary to work our way up that hierarchy to get to the organs and organ systems we want to spend our time on. Remember also, starting next week, you've got some assignments that are coming due. Your Unit 1 lab review is due. Remember, those lab reviews have 2 parts, a check your recall and a check your understanding. And so both parts of those are due, graded for completeness. You would do the Labster homeostasis. That is also due at the beginning of class on Tuesday. Remember, you must complete the entire thing 100% and then also get it 80% correct to get full credit. I will warn you right now to stop the emails. When you complete that activity, because it is synced with Canvas, when you complete it, it automatically puts in your grade. So let's say, for instance, you got it 95% correct, right? When you got it 95% correct, it's going to input your grade as, 17.5 points or whatever that's going to be. I will then go back in and change it to the full credit. So when you complete it and you're only getting 18 points because you got 80% correct or something like that, or 90% correct, know that I will go back in and I will correct the grades for those who completed it up to the level that needs to be completed. So don't worry about that. That will be there. Sydney, yes, did you have a question?
Is it going to do that for the, Introduction to Mastering Anatomy and Physiology 2? Because that one didn't go into my Canvas.
So it should be, I will double check to make sure that it auto inputs. It also should auto input. The one thing I will say is sometimes the Mastering A&P is weird. Sometimes when it updates, it only brings over part of the grade and then the rest of it shows up later. So if you only got like 1.5 points out of the 4 or something like that, check again the next day. And if it's still showing the incorrect score, then let me know. But I will double check to make sure. I believe I have it set up to import automatically.
I want to say I did it on Tuesday night and it still just has a dash. It doesn't have any numbers.
Okay, then the importing may not be happening properly. So I'll have to double check that. So I will double check that. Let me add that to my list. Also, I tried to contact the bookstore. I still haven't heard back from them yet either. So I apologize. I'm having the same problem you guys are with the bookstore stuff. Mastering A&P. All right, I will get that upset. I'm sorry?
I ordered mine through the bookstore and they sent me the email that they're ready now.
Oh, okay, awesome. That's good. Well, but there was some disparity about one of the things and some of the other stuff. So excellent. All right.
So when I get them, I'm going to pick them up today. I can email you and tell you what came with it and what didn't.
Perfect. I would appreciate that. Thank you very much for that. Excellent, excellent. All right, the lab waivers and student info sheets are also due. Again, I can't emphasize 2 things enough. One, how silly it is that we have to do a lab waiver form, but also how serious it is as well. If you do not complete the lab waiver form and turn it in, they will not let you take this class. This is considered a lab class. To complete a lab class, you must sign a lab waiver. If you don't sign the lab waiver, I cannot keep you enrolled in the class. So please make sure you complete that lab waiver form. And as we were just talking about, the Mastering A&P introduction as a 4-point assignment is due by the end of the day on Tuesday. So I can remind you again on Tuesday as well. So check your recall and check your understanding. If you look at the reviews in the labs, they have 2 parts. The whole thing says Unit 1 review, but it has 2 parts to it. Check your recall and check your understanding. And again, I'm giving you the page numbers as well to make it easy. Since we're talking about that, though, let's talk about Unit 3, which is due on Thursday. Every single unit in your lab manual has the pre-lab at the beginning, all of the activities, and then the review at the end. except Unit 3. I don't know why they did it differently on Unit 3. My guess is that with Unit 3, it is because it's about the microscope, so there's really no critical thinking questions about that. So as you look at Unit 3 in the entire unit, what you'll see is at the top of the page is the review questions, and at the bottom of the page are the activities. Obviously, you don't have microscopes, so you're not going to be able to do the activities, but you can still read through them to understand how a microscope works if you haven't worked with microscopes before. But know that through the entire unit, pages 62 through 68, you will find the 10 review questions at the top of that. So that's the only one that they've done wonky that way. I don't know why. I complain about it with every edition, and they continue to do it this way. So whatever. Another labs are due also on Thursday next week. 1 week from today, we will be doing our practice lab exam. This is no points. This is just for you to have a chance to gauge how you're being successful in studying for this class, because it'll be 1 week before the real exam. You don't need the course ID as long as you go to the MyLab through our Canvas site. However, if you purchase the bundle, you have a code, so you don't have to pay for the MyLab and mastering, but you also have the option of buying it separate on its own. But do it through Canvas, and if you do it through Canvas, you will not need the course ID for that. Tuesday, Unit 4 review, your Physio X. Remember the Physio X's you are doing as those activities. You are going to have 5 lab reports, and you are inputting, right? You are submitting those through the Canvas site for that. 1 more labster, and then Thursday the 4th, we have our first lab and lecture exam. So we got a busy couple weeks ahead of us. All right. Questions on any of that?
I have a question about
Yes.
the syllabus and proctor quiz.
Okay.
It says it's due by February 3rd.
No, it is due today. Is when it is due. However, the point of the syllabus quiz is for us to make sure that you understand the proper rules about how to take an exam using Proctorio. Because I want to use a low stakes 10-point assignment like this to figure those out, so that the first time you use Proctorio isn't on your 100-point lecture exam. Because if on your 100-point lecture exam, you don't properly scan your workspace, and then you're staring off to the left during the entire exam, you're going to get a 0 for that exam. Because even though that's your thinking face, I have no idea what you were looking at. So it is very important that we work out those kinks now. In fact, that question is a perfect lead in to what I wanted to talk about next, which was indeed that quiz. I have graded many of the Proctorio quizzes, not all of them yet, but many of them, and tried to be thorough with my notes to you on those. When you go to an assignment that has been grading, you should be able to see the notes on those to be able to understand them. But because these are issues that have come up a lot, I want to make sure that I address them with everybody. For starters, probably the things that I had to write the most on these is to scan your area more slowly and to scan your entire work area. Just doing this is not scanning your area. I don't want to just see the left side of your table. I want to see your entire workspace. Right. A lot of people did a great job of lifting their laptops up and rotating them around. That's awesome. I get to see all your beautiful art on the wall, but I don't care about the art on your wall. What I care about is what is on your desk. So slowly show me the desk, show me the wall behind you if you're sitting at a desk, so that I don't know you don't have a chart or papers or things along those lines there. Right now, a couple people mentioned that they have desktops that have built-in cameras. I spoke with the dean and I spoke with some of the other instructors, and that is perfectly fine. But what you're going to need, and I don't have one, but what you're going to need is a mirror. Take that mirror and using the mirror, show me your entire workspace around you. So angle the camera so that you can see. And again, you should be able to see on the screen what you're doing. So slowly show me your area around your workspace. If you do not do that properly on a real test, you will lose points and could possibly get a 0. The least that'll happen is 10% loss in your grade, which guarantees you're not getting an A. And then depending on then what other activities you participate in during that, like I said, if you're constantly looking to the left and I have no idea what's to the left, you could easily get a 0 on that. The chemistry quizzes are graded automatically. So again, nobody lost points on the Proctorio for that. But again, this because it's a learning activity. I have not had a chance to check the chemistry quizzes yet. I know you get your grade automatically because it's just all multiple choice questions, but I will be viewing the Proctorios on that as well to make sure that that you've done it properly on there as well. So you've got 2 opportunities to learn from this, but after that, you will start to lose points if you don't do it properly. All right, so that is very, very important. Yes, Dimitra.
So you look at like every student's proctorio before their exam, like you go through every single student's beginning proctorio?
Yes, through every single one.
Interesting. Okay, well, props to you.
No, not props to me. It's horrible and I hate it, but it's necessary. Like one of the things that I've talked about is as I've said many times, I like this class because this class is hard. I don't have to be tricky. And I see my job as an instructor to get out of the way of the information and make that information gaining process as smooth as possible so that the process of it is invisible. And the problem with doing this online is that online is all about process. And so it is exhausting, it is frustrating, it is not the way this class should be taught, but I fully appreciate and endorse the reason that we're doing this. I understand and appreciate why we're doing this. And while it does suck, it is a short-term hardship that is going to give us a tremendous long-term gain, which is really a good way to think about this class in general. One of the things that we're going to talk about in a bit is the student info sheets. And one of the things that people were talking about was juggling that balance between life and school. And that's really the key focus for this. You got to realize that for the next 16 weeks, you are going to be undergoing short-term hardships, short-term sacrifices to your time with your family, to your time with other things, to your free time and things along those lines, but you are going to gain long-term rewards from this. Did I see someone raise their hand? It went away. Laura, was it Laura that raised their hand? Somebody raised their hand? Yeah.
Quick question. I'm not sure if you answered it, is the daily quizzes, are those on Proctorio as well, or is it just going to be through Canvas?
Great question. No. Well, technically all of these are through Canvas, but yeah, no. The daily quizzes are 5 minutes, 5 questions, 5 points, and that it would take longer to set the Proctorio up than it would take to take the quizzes. So for the daily quizzes, you are not using Proctorio. You'll be using Proctorio for all of the big things, the lab exam, the lecture exam, the final.
Thank you.
Chemistry quiz, you've had 48 hours to take the chemistry quiz. If you've not completed it, unfortunately, it cannot be completed late. So you will lose the points for that. However, as I mentioned, the Proctorio exam I have left open for you to take late because I want to make sure that you have a chance to experience Proctorio so we can work out the issue. So as someone mentioned earlier, it's available until February 3rd, which is the day before the exam, because I want to make sure that you experience Proctorio before we do it for real on a test. Because if I see the errors like I saw on these first round of them on the test, people are losing points. So again, slowly scan your entire workspace, including down. I want to see your desktop. I want to make sure that you don't have materials or your lab manual or your phone or any of those types of things there. Be careful about the lighting. It doesn't do you any good to scan the area. It's they're not free 10 points. It's a quiz. You have to take the quiz and get the points. You get the points for the number of things that you get right. Read the instructions in the syllabus, read the instructions in the Proctorio, and yeah, hopefully they're pretty free. Take it with good lighting. Again, it doesn't do any good to scan your area if I can't see it. Also, Proctorio does watch your eye movements. If it is too dark, it has trouble seeing that. The same problem occurs if you're too much backlit. If you're right by a window and have a lot of bright light behind you, it makes you very dim. So please be cognizant of that. Again, you have a view on the screen of what the camera is seeing. So you should be able to look at yourself and see what kind of lighting you have around you. Now, again, if you don't like looking at yourself during the quiz or it freaks you out to do that, you can close that window, but at least look at it first to make sure that the lighting is good. Keep your head in the center of the camera. Nobody was really bad on this, but I did have a handful where I just saw a bunch of the top of people's heads like this during the exam. Again, I need to be able to see you. Try to keep yourself in the center of the camera. And again, I know it's not intuitive to be on camera while you're taking an exam, but I promise you, you will get used to it. Do not have a second monitor on the screen, on the table with you. A lot of you are using laptops, and like myself, I'm using a laptop, and then I have a monitor for my old computer sitting here next to it. It is better that you remove that laptop if you can. If you cannot, turn it around. If you can't do that, then at least cover it. I know when you scanned the room and showed it to me, it was off, but there's nothing that says that your buddy couldn't come and turn it on. So again, it's about being open in the process. Try to make it as obvious as possible that you're trying to maintain the integrity of the class. Yeah,
So
perfect.
Dr. Slutsky,
Yes.
when it comes to actually having a second monitor, Proctorio can tell that you have a second monitor. Like
Yes. Hold on.
Yeah.
They can't, but if you have a second, like I have a laptop, this
Yeah.
monitor is not connected to my laptop. It's connected to a separate computer. So
Yeah.
there's nothing that says that you couldn't have Google up on the second computer, and Proctorio obviously would have no way of knowing that.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. I was like, well, it stopped me on mine.
Yes.
So
No, yeah. If you have a desktop where you have two monitors, it will
Yeah.
restrict you to one monitor that way, but it doesn't restrict you if you have a second computer.
okay,
Right. So that's what
I just wanted to clarify. I was like, wait.
No, I appreciate that. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, and again, I appreciate if you unplug it. I appreciate if you turn it around. That's great. I know sometimes the wiring and stuff can be tricky, so just take a towel and put it over the top of it. You just want to be obvious about the point that you're maintaining the integrity of the class. Again, no earphones, no earbuds. If your microphone is on your headset, then just have it sitting on the counter next to you. That's fine. Make sure it can hear. The sound isn't an issue. There were a couple quizzes where the audio was not picked up, and so that is an issue. But again, I've tried to contact the people where that was an issue. And then again, this is a silly thing, but I found out at least one of my instructor friends have done the same thing. Remember, when it says to hold up your ID, you're not holding the ID up to the screen. You're holding it up to the camera so that it centers in the screen. It just has to be a photo ID. So it can be a state ID or a driver's license. That would be fine, but a school ID is perfectly acceptable as well. I don't want your Blockbuster card or something like that, but your student ID is perfectly acceptable. I know Blockbusters aren't a thing anymore. I don't care. All right, excellent. Again, also, I do actually look at those student info sheets, and there are a couple issues on those that I wanted to address. Actually, I was very impressed. This class always has a large amount of pre-nursing, but there was a wide diversity of students in this class. So I'm kind of excited about that. A lot of different interests that you guys are coming at to this one. That makes it a little bit more fun. You were also pretty committal. A lot of people just said they want to learn everything, and that's great. But terminology, cells, disorders, pregnancies, basically anything bad that can happen to the body, they were interested in those kind of things. And then, of course, the normal things, bones and stuff along those lines. I addressed this a little bit, but I want to address this again. I threw a lot of information at you in the last class, and we talked about it as well. As I mentioned earlier, this class is going to involve sacrifices. And that primary sacrifice that you're going to be doing is time. Under the best of circumstances, this class takes a lot of time, right? And this isn't the best of circumstances. This class is so much more intuitive when you can get hands and knee deep into it. When you get to play with a cadaver, when you get to dissect a rat, when you get to hold a bone in your hand, it is easier to learn these things. And unfortunately, we're not getting a chance to do any of those things. The attendance quiz, for those of you who have not taken it, it's LOCK, L-O-C-K, all lowercase. Please make sure you have taken it so you don't get kicked out of the class. So it takes time. And I mean time, but I also mean it's how you spend that time. Studying 30 hours a week, 20 hours a week for this class will be pretty good, but it's also how you spend that time, right? For most people, this class is going to be very different from how you normally study, especially with our busy lives, especially with our families, especially with work and everything else. Right? I was guilty of it as well. When I was back in college, if I had a class, a test on Monday, I would lock myself in my room on Sunday and spend 12 hours on Sunday studying for that exam and do just fine. And in most classes, you can get away with that. Because in psychology or chemistry or something like that, you've got 2 or 3 big topics that you need to know for that exam. And in 12 straight hours, you can master those 3 topics. The problem in this class is there aren't 3 big topics. There are 100 little topics. The good news about that is every single one of those topics is pretty easy. The same thing's not true for chemistry or physics. You could stare at a chemistry equation or a physics proof for an hour and not be any closer to understanding it. If I give you a bone and give you an hour with that bone, you're going to have mastered that bone by the end of the hour. You're going to know everything about it, right? The problem is that you don't have to learn just one bone. You have to learn 206 of them, and you have 2.5 weeks to do it, right? And so what it is, it's 100 little things. And you can't sit down for 12 straight hours and learn 100 little things. By hour 4, you've forgotten everything from hour 1. So you have to be really good at spreading your time around. Take those 20 hours, those 30 hours that you're going to spend studying, and don't do it in a row. Do 3 hours a day, do a half an hour, and then take a break. Steal 5 minutes from your lunchtime when you're at work, or when you're standing in line at Starbucks, pull a flashcard out of your pocket or something along those lines, Quizlet on your phone, any number of things. Find ways to spread it out, use repetition, and those are the things that are going to help you to be successful. And it's going to be long and it's going to be exhausting, but remember, these are short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. One of the other, all right, for lack of a better word, disturbing things that I saw on this was that there are a lot of people who are in 2 unenviable situations. The first is people retaking this class. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with retaking this class. However, in some ways it can be very beneficial because you already have some familiarity. But that's the trap. The trap to this class, especially if it was me you took for 430, the trap to retaking a class like this is that familiarity. The problem is while you're sitting here in lecture and we hit hour 2.5 and you're exhausted and I'm rambling on and I'm talking about something that is familiar to you. And the thought is, oh yeah, I remember that from last time I took this class. I'm familiar with that. I'm good with that. And that familiarity breeds content. If we think we're familiar with something, we're not going to spend as much time focusing on it and concerned on it and worrying about it. And so for those of you who are retaking this, I want you to remind you that you're retaking this because you weren't satisfied with your grade the first time. You weren't successful your first time. So keep that fear. Don't get comfortable with the material. You're here for a reason. Be successful, stay sharp, stay inquisitive, stay afraid, because that fear can drive and motivate you to be successful. The second thing I want to talk about is a surprising number of you are trying to take this and micro at the same time. Now, I promised my wife I wouldn't call those of you who are doing this stupid, so I will not do that. But what I will say is that many of you, as I saw, are looking at getting into nursing programs or respiratory programs or things like that that are highly competitive. And in these classes, grades matter. I appreciate it's hard. Most of you are in here because these are the last couple classes you need to take. And you're anxious to get on your way and you're anxious to get started. But if you rush and take too big of a workload, then you're not going to get the grades that you want. And there's a huge difference between getting an A and a B in this class in micro than there is getting 2 A's when it looks at getting into the programs that you want. As labor intensive as this class is, as unintuitive as taking this class is online, micro is just as bad, if not worse. So both of these classes require a tremendous amount of time, a tremendous amount of effort. Have I had students who took both at the same time and were successful? Yes, but most are not. If anything, we encourage you to take, well, okay, we don't encourage you, but it's more acceptable to take 431 and micro at the same time. The content relates to itself a little bit better. And by having taken 430 first, you know how much time it takes you to be successful in this class like this. And you know whether you can double up on that. If you're coming at this fresh, you may not fully appreciate really how much time you're going to put into this. And to try to do 2 of them can be really, really tricky. So just please have your eyes open, be honest with yourself about what you are capable of doing. Because like I said, I know for most of you, the grades in these classes matter. So I don't want you setting yourself in a position where you won't be successful. You won't get the grades that you want. All right, last and least important, a couple people were interested in my information. I have been teaching at American River College for, this is my 14th year. I've been in the Los Rios district for, 18, something like that. And I taught at Davis and a couple other places before that. Speaking of Davis, I did both my undergraduate and my graduate work at UC Davis. I spent far too much time than any one living sane person should do in the Davis area. Again, was forced by law to ride my bike 2 hours a day, just like everybody else. But in there, I got my, my PhD in neuroscience, studying the development of the visual system. So that is my area of expertise. All right. Any questions on any of that? Yes.
Just a quick one. Was micro easy for you? Like micro and 430 and all of this stuff. Was it easy for you to pass?
Well, you got to remember, back when I took micro, we didn't know about it, any of this stuff. So, and I will say, here's what I will say. One of my favoriteest people in the whole wide world, a really good friend of mine, teaches micro at Cosumnes River College. She is an amazing instructor. Julie Oliver is her name. If any of you have the opportunity to take a class from her, I highly recommend it. And I have sat in on many of her lectures. And what I can tell you with 100% certainty is I am fairly certain that her and every other micro instructor is making up at least 2/3 of the stuff they talk about. Most of that stuff, there's no way those things are true. Prions, proteins that can't be broken down, all that stuff is completely made up. So that's my thought on micro. Good question. What I recommend for 430 versus 431 is really to help you to, oh, cool, someone had her. Yeah, she's amazing. So there's an advantage to taking the same instructor for both 430 and 431 because you know what their expectations are, you know their teaching style, and more importantly, you know their testing style. One of the things we didn't talk about in this class, and we usually talk about it after the first exam, is there's really 2 things you need to do to be successful in a class like this. You have to be able to cram information into your brain, and you have to be able to take the test. Taking a test is a skill, and it can be practiced and it can be learned, right? It doesn't matter what 430 teacher you have. The femur is the femur is the femur. The femur bone is the femur bone. It just is. But how all the different AMP instructors grade you on that femur may be entirely different. So what I say is if you have a 430 instructor whose teaching style and testing style, drop my pen, is compatible with your learning style, then yeah, by all means, try to take them again. And we do try to provide that opportunity by having the same instructor teach the same class at the same time the next time. So again, we've got this class on Tuesday, Thursday from noon to 4:30. The expectation in the fall is that I will be teaching 431 on Tuesday, Thursday from noon to 4:30. So that if this time works for you now, it should hopefully work for you in the fall and you have that opportunity, but it's not required. And more importantly, my goal is not to train you to be successful in only my 431 class, but my goal is to train you to be successful in anybody's 431 class. In fact, in my 431 class, they have a student info sheet just like you do. The only difference is the first question on theirs is who did you have for 431? Because I know that if a couple names show up on that list, that student may struggle because not every instructor is necessarily as vigorous as they need to be. All right, great questions. Any others? All right, excellent. Then from there, let's get back into lecture. As I mentioned, today we're going to first talk about our first major physiological process, and that is really the only physiological process, maintaining homeostasis. As you can see here, we have a small paragraph on the board. Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium in the body's internal environment produced by the ceaseless interplay of all of the body's regulatory processes. And I know because I have this on the board, I'm sure half of you are furiously writing this down. And that's okay, because when you do that, you can then call grandma after class today and say, hey, grandma, guess what? Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium in the body's internal environment produced by the ceaseless interplay of all the body's regulatory processes. And grandma will be really impressed and she'll send you 20 bucks in the mail. However, we can take this concept and distill it into a very simple, easy to understand phrase. Homeostasis is dynamic stability. Someone tell me what dynamic means?
Something with sound?
Okay, it can be, but what about the sound? Sound is something that can be dynamic, but if a sound is dynamic, what is that sound doing?
It's getting louder.
Or it's changing, absolutely. Dynamic means constantly changing. What does stability mean?
Not changing.
Not changing, there you go, exactly. So how can we have dynamic stability? Well, I'll explain. Give me an example of some characteristic of the body that we maintain the homeostasis of.
Temperature.
Temperature, excellent. Temperature is a great example. With temperature, if I were to take everybody's temperature right now, everybody's temperature would be exactly 98.6, right?
No.
No.
No, of course not. Catherine, if I took your temperature right now, do you think it'd be 98.6? Probably not. Maybe it would be 98.1 or whatever it is. And if I took it 15 minutes from now, would it still be 98.1?
No.
Probably not. The fact that you've been sitting here quietly listening to me, maybe you've gotten a little cold, or maybe it's 97.9. If I take it 2 hours from now, maybe it's going to be 98.9. If I take it tomorrow at this exact same time, maybe it'll be 99.0, right? Notice your temperature is dynamic. It is constantly changing because your behaviors are changing. You're eating, you're drinking, you're sitting still for a while, you're exercising. Our temperature is dynamic. It is constantly changing. However, if I were to take Catherine's temperature 2 days from now, is it ever going to be 115?
I hope not.
Hopefully not. Should it be 62.5?
Hopefully not.
No, hopefully not. Exactly. While it is constantly changing, while our temperature is dynamic, it is dynamic within a very narrow range of values. So there is a very stable range of values through which it is constantly changing. So we get this constant change, but in a very stable range. And it's not just true for temperature. It's how much oxygen we have in the blood, how much glucose we have in the blood, right? Our pH, all sorts of things like this, how much water we have. All of these concepts in our body, we maintain in this dynamic stability, where it is constantly in flux, but within a narrow range of values. So homeostasis is really about maintaining a dynamic stability. Right? It's about balance. And of course, to maintain balance, we need to obviously be able to control it or regulate it. What of those 11 organ systems we talked about in the last class might play a role in helping us to regulate homeostasis in our body?
Nervous system.
I'm sorry, hold on, guys. You got to give me one quick second here. I apologize for that. I guess I'm used to talking about this in the classroom. I don't think about it while I'm at home. I have 2 kids, as I've mentioned. One of my daughters has an extreme peanut and tree nut allergy. So unfortunately, anytime my kid's school calls, I panic. I'm afraid some kid has rubbed peanut butter on her or something else like that has happened. So luckily, it was just one of those stupid robocalls about something or another. So I do apologize for that, but that was not a phone call I could ignore. I apologize immensely for that, but I do apologize. But that is why I felt I had to take that. So I do apologize. All right, excellent. So real quickly. Well, I got sidetracked. I apologize. That was horrible. How is it regulated? How is homeostasis regulated? What are the 2 of the 11 organ systems? Well, so integument does definitely plays a role, but how do we regulate it? Where do we control it? Didn't we talk about having 2 organ systems that were specialized for communication?
Endocrine
The-
and
Endocrine.
And there we go, nervous. Endocrine and the nervous system. Excellent. Our nervous system and our endocrine system. All right, those are the 2 systems that are specialized for communication. Those are the ones that regulate homeostasis in our body. And again, as I mentioned, it is about keeping balance. To maintain this balance, we need a couple of characteristics, right? And again, this isn't a concept we're not used to. We're familiar with this kind of stuff all the time. Obviously, the first thing that happens is there has to be some type of disturbance. Right? So there's some type of disturbance that occurs. And as a result of that, what's the first thing that has to happen? So let's say, for instance, the disturbance, let's take it into an environment that we understand. Your house. You have, you want to maintain the appropriate temperature in the house. And you have horrible high school kids like I do that run outside and leave a door open, especially on their way to school in the morning like this. So when they leave the door open, we've got all that cold air coming in. So that is our disturbance, right? So what's the first thing that has to happen for us to be able to bring it back into balance?
Action potential.
Okay, true. There's got to be some, okay, but something has to produce that action potential. What has to produce that action potential?
Sensory nerves.
Yeah, exactly. The first thing that has to happen is that we have to be made aware. We must become aware of the disturbance. Right? Again, we have to work on our analogies because our analogies don't normally work the way that they normally would. Normally, we'd be sitting in the classroom right now. And I said, as we were sitting here in the classroom, if someone was breaking into your house right now, if there was a disturbance, would it change your behavior in the class? And what would your answer to that be?
No, because how would you know someone's breaking in your house?
No, because you wouldn't know that someone was breaking into your house. If you're sitting in the classroom, right, unless your house is across the street and you have a really loud alarm, you're not going to know that it's going on. You have to be aware of it. Or if I was sitting here blowing a dog whistle, if I was blowing a dog whistle, would it change anybody's behavior in the class right now?
No.
No, because none of us are able to hear it. So the first thing that happens is we must become aware of the disturbance. And to do that, we have to have some type of receptor. And that receptor receives the information, right? In this case, in the case of our house with the door being open, luckily for us, we have a thermometer in the house that is measuring the temperature, and it shows that the temperature has dropped. So the first thing we need when there's a disturbance is to have some type of receptor. That receptor then sends information to our command center. As we just talked about, our command center is either the nervous system or the endocrine system. And what our command system does is 3 things. It receives the information. And once it receives that information, it is going to process the information. Right? Compare it to our memory. And then it is going to make a decision on how we are going to resolve this issue. Again, if we're sticking with the analogy of our door being open, in this case, it's the thermostat. Right? In my house, we like to keep the house at a nice, during the winter, we like to keep it at a nice brisk 85 degrees in the house. Right? So what happens is the door gets left open, a little bit of cold air comes in, and the house drops to 82. And the thermostat says, hey, the house is supposed to be at 85. The temperature now is 82. There's a disturbance. Temperature has dropped, and we need to bring the temperature back into balance. Now, is the command center able to bring the house back into balance by itself? No. Once it makes a decision, it then sends the information, and it sends that information to what we call, the effector. The effector is what affects the change, with that goal of bringing the body back into balance. In this case, the example we've been talking about, this would be the furnace, the heater. That would kick on and would cancel the disturbance and bring the body back into balance. Now, we don't have heaters per se in our body. So in our body, what are the structures that can be effectors? What are the things that we use in our body to bring us back into balance?
Your muscles.
Excellent. But if we know muscles come in different flavors, how many different flavors does a muscle come in the human body?
600.
3. What are they? Well, those are the different types. What are the 3 types of muscles?
Smooth, cardiac, and skeletal.
There you go. Smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. So which one can be used as an effector to bring our body back into balance?
Well, what kind of balance? Like, are you talking about like temperature wise?
Sure, that's a good start. We're talking about temperature. What would that one be?
I don't want to say smooth. Skeletal?
Skeletal, there you go. You shiver, right? Skeletal muscle. But what about the other 2, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle? Do you think they can be effectors?
Yes, smooth could be used as one.
Yeah, you have that nice big cheeseburger for breakfast. Your stomach stretches as a result of it, and then it starts churning. So we use our smooth muscle. And if skeletal muscle can and smooth muscle can, then do you think possibly cardiac muscle can as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else? Can anything else besides our 3 types of muscles, do you think, be effectors?
So would like our sweat glands be an effector as well?
Bingo. If instead of getting cold, we ran around the room 16 times and got hot, we would sweat as a result of that. So absolutely, in the body, the things that can be effectors, the things that can bring our body back into balance, are going to be skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So again, as we've talked about, to maintain this balance, we need a receptor that notices there's a change, sends that information to the command center, which then influences an effector.
Oh, shit.
Right. Someone could mute themselves if they're the ones that are being chased by the police. Drive carefully, please. All right, excellent. All right, hold on. I buried my chat window. There it is. Excellent. All righty. So here's that picture. But again, we just talked about the components of what is necessary. You have a disturbance. That disturbance is an opening of a leftover window that's left open. We have our sensor, our receptor that perceives the information, sends that information to our command center, our thermostat, makes a decision, sends information to the furnace, the effector, and brings the room back into balance. And guess what? The human body works the exact same way. You step outside to get the mail or get the newspaper in the morning in your pajamas, and the door locks behind you. And the problem is you don't wear pajamas. So there you are, butt naked, out on the front porch, and it's cold outside this morning, right? And we have cold receptors in our skin that perceive that information, send that information to our brain, the command center, and our command center makes a decision. Our body is cold, we need to heat it up. So it sends a signal to our skeletal muscle, and we start to shiver, generating heat and bringing our body temperature back up into balance. Here we show this in the pretty pictures. And here, again, we can see this with this nice flow chart as well. And just like we also talked about, if instead you're running around your room 17 times, body temperature goes up and our glands become active to sweat to bring us back into balance. All right, questions on that? Excellent. And this is a dynamic process. Back in ancient times, and by ancient times, I mean like 10 years ago, when that thermostat you had on the wall, you had to make a decision. It had the almighty switch on it, where you could switch it to heater, or you could switch it to air conditioner, right? But now, thanks to Nest, everything is smart, right? In fact, my sister, when she was pregnant, right, you can now set a range of temperatures that you want, so that you set the range of temperatures to wherever it is. And if the temperature goes too high, the air conditioning comes on and brings it down. If the temperature gets too low, the heater comes on and comes back up. And when my sister was pregnant, her range was 72 degrees. She had to have her house exactly 72 degrees. If it was half a degree warmer, she was pouring sweat. Half a degree lower, she was shivering from freezing. It was precisely 72 degrees. So again, we have that dynamic stability, constant changes within that range. All right. Questions on that? How are we on time? We're doing good. Perfect. And again, it works the same way with the body as well. Now, there's one more important concept as well. Right? Let's talk about that example of being cold. There's the disturbance, we get cold, we shiver as a response. And once we start shivering, do we shiver from now till the end of time? Once you get cold and start shivering, are you shivering forever then? The rest of your life you're shivering?
No.
No, of course not. And the reason for that is we are constantly monitoring and adjusting this system with what we call a feedback mechanism or a feedback loop. And in fact, as I'm sure many of you know, there are indeed two different types of feedback loops. What are they?
Positive and negative.
There you go. We got a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop. Excellent, 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 right? And of course, as we can tell by the names, one of them is good and one of them is bad, correct?
No.
No, that's not what we mean. That is not what we mean by positive and negative in this case. So, but let's talk about what we do mean. Negative feedback doesn't mean that it is a negative process. What it means is the true meaning of the word negate, which is to cancel or reverse. And again, the best way to think about this is, remember, it's all about balance. If I'm trying to balance this pen on my finger and it starts to fall to the right, if I want to bring it back in balance, I have to reverse that or cancel that disturbance and bring it back to the left. If it goes too far to the left, I have to cancel it and bring it back to the right. So negative feedback means that we negate or we cancel the original stimulus. And this is the primary way, or certainly the most common form that we have in the body. We just talked about two great examples. Temperature drops, we shiver to cancel the disturbance and bring it back. We get too hot, we sweat to cancel the disturbance and bring the temperature back down. Right? So by far, negative feedbacks are the most common type, and there are dozens and dozens of examples. Well, if a negative feedback, we cancel the disturbance, then that means in a positive feedback, we actually enhance the disturbance. So again, if we go back to me balancing this pen on my finger, if it starts to fall to the right, it doesn't make sense that I could bring it in balance by making it go even more to the right. That doesn't mean that make a lot of sense, unless maybe I bring it all the way back around. Right? I know the analogy falls apart a little bit there, but in this case, the goal is indeed to enhance the disturbance. And probably the best way to understand this is to talk about some of the most common examples. What are some of the most common examples? There aren't a lot, but there's a couple that people know. Madison's got her hand up. What do you got, Madison?
Child labor.
Labor, absolutely.
So fun.
Parturition, absolutely. Giving birth. Giving birth is a process that is incredibly enjoyable, right? A rapid process, completely non-painful, enjoyable for everybody involved. No, but you got absolutely the right idea. So what happens?
So pretty much like when a woman's like the baby's ready to come out, your contractions, that's your stimulus to let your body know like, okay, this thing's coming. And as your contractions, you know, they say, oh, like it's 2 minutes apart. Great. Like once it's like 30 seconds apart.
Right.
That's the enhancement. That's your body saying this is a positive feedback. This is the way it's supposed to be.
Right. So, and again, and another thing to remember too, when we talk about these things, let's remember to talk about the components. In this case, again, remember we've got a disturbance. We've got, let me give myself enough space to do this. We got a disturbance. We've got a some type of receptor. We have a command center. And we have an effector. Right? So in this case, the disturbance is indeed the baby wants out. The way the baby tells us that is by being head down, face down, right, pointed towards the cervix. And in the cervix, we have some stretch receptors. And what happens is, as baby is down there by the cervix, it pushes on the cervix and stretches the cervix. And these stretch receptors receive that stretch, and they send that information to our brain, our command center. And what the command center does is it releases a special hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin goes to the smooth muscle of the uterus. And as you mentioned, it causes the contraction.
Yep.
Yep. Now, when that uterus squeezes the baby, it pushes the baby harder against the cervix. And when that occurs, we get a bigger stretch. And when we get a bigger stretch, a bigger signal goes to the brain and it releases more oxytocin. And when it releases more oxytocin, we get a larger contraction, which pushes the baby even harder, stretching even more, releasing even more oxytocin. Notice each time around, we're enhancing it and getting it bigger and bigger and bigger until those contractions become so strong that what happens?
The baby comes out.
Well, you gotta push, actually.
Well, yes. Okay. Obviously,
Well, like everything in phases, and then
yeah,
it descends.
But you got the right idea. Ultimately, baby is expulsed, right? Now, once that baby is expulsed, the body is back in homeostatic balance, right? Life no longer is in homeostatic balance, but the body is back in balance. What's the other big example besides giving birth to a baby?
I had it in my old notes, dang it.
Blood clotting. Blood clotting.
Blood clotting, excellent. Let's do the same thing, right? We have a disturbance, we have a cut. When we have a cut, what ends up happening is that we have chemicals that are released. That cut causes chemicals to be released. And those chemicals, oops, what happens? There we go. And in this case, that chemical sends a signal through our blood to the endocrine system, right? We have chemoreceptors that receive that chemical signal. And what ends up happening is that we send platelets. Platelets are attracted to the area. When platelets are attracted to the area, they attach to the damaged tissue. And when they attach to the damaged tissue, what those platelets do is actually swell and burst, releasing even more chemicals, bringing even more platelets to the area, which attach and swell and release chemicals, bringing even more platelets to the area, which attach and swell and release even more chemicals. And again, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger till we have so many platelets there that it basically plugs the damage and you stop losing blood. So notice, whether we are canceling the disturbance or whether we are enhancing the disturbance, the goal is the same. The goal is to bring the body back into balance. That is our goal. All right, questions on that? All right, excellent. And again, these flow charts are not from your textbook, but I really like them, so that's why I put them in the lecture notes. Here we see the example of a negative feedback, in this case, blood pressure. Blood pressure in a vessel gets too high. So when the blood pressure gets too high, it causes the blood vessel to stretch, sends a signal to the brain, and the brain tells the heart, don't beat so fast, don't beat so hard. Slow down, pump a little softer. Less blood is put into the blood vessels and blood pressure comes down. And we just talked about oxytocin and childbirth. So again, I like these flow charts, so that's why I put them in the lecture. But again, it's just redundant information, but a good visual to look at. All right, so our goal of homeostasis is to get the body back into balance. Unfortunately, we're not always successful in getting the body back into balance. And when we're not successful getting the body back into balance, those disruptions are typically what lead to cellular damage, ultimately to disease, and in extreme cases can lead to death. So our job as healthcare professionals is to help people to reestablish imbalances. And one of the ways that we do that is by noting and paying attention to disorders and diseases. Now, a disorder is an abnormality of function, where a disease is a specific illness. So let's say, for instance, I have an upset tummy. Is that a disorder or a disease?
Disorder.
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 If I have multiple sclerosis, is that a disorder or a disease?
Disease.
Disease. If I have hepatitis, is that a disorder or a disease?
Disease.
Disease. What does hepatitis actually mean? Anyone know?
Inflammation of, I think, is it liver?
Exactly. Hepatitis is inflammation of the liver. Absolutely. Now, in that case, it is a disorder. Now, I purposely use that as an example because it's tricky. Because one of the things that can cause an inflammation of the liver is the virus hepatitis C or hepatitis B or M or whatever hepatitis we're up to now. There are all these hepatitis viruses called A and B and C and D and all of those. And those can definitely cause liver inflammation, and that would definitely be a disease. However, I could also have hepatitis because during quarantine, I've been drinking vodka for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And after doing that for 12 straight months, right, my liver is quite inflamed as a result of that. So hepatitis, be careful, it just means inflammation of the liver. But if I said hepatitis, someone had hepatitis B, then that would be a specific disease. Now, when diagnosing diseases and disorders, we look for recognizable signs and symptoms. Signs are objective and symptoms are subjective. What does that mean?
So symptoms would be like feelings like nausea, vomiting.
Which one would those be?
Symptoms.
Okay.
Well, I don't know.
No, you're absolutely correct. Those are indeed symptoms.
And then signs would be like things that they don't feel. So patients who I guess have like, the only thing I can think of would be like jaundice of the skin, because you can.
Okay. But you don't think you're right, someone wouldn't feel that, but you don't think someone would be aware of that?
Well, they would be aware of it, yeah.
They would be aware of it. But I like where you're going with this. You absolutely have the right kind of ideas. And there's a kind of a simple way to remember these things. A symptom is something that the patient has to tell you. Whereas a sign is something that you can measure yourself. Or that you can tell the patient, let's say that. Now, again, we use the term measure, but you have to be careful with this here. Obviously, if I take your temperature, if I put the pulse ox on you to see how much oxygen is in your blood, if I tell you the pH of your blood, all of those are measurements, and all of those would indeed be signs. However, one of the things that they have on the wall when you walk into the doctor's office is a chart that says, what is your pain level from 0 to 7? Is that objective or subjective?
Subjective.
Subjective, absolutely, right? Alyssa looks strong and sturdy. I'm sure a broken leg for her would be like a 2.5 on that scale. I get a hangnail, that's a solid 6.5, right? So again, that is even though it's a number, it is still subjective. So I'm telling you what my pain level is. I'm telling you I have an upset tummy or I'm feeling nauseous, right? Whereas if I'm measuring your temperature, or as Sydney pointed out, if I'm measuring the yellowness of your skin, that is absolutely a sign.
I have a question.
I have an answer.
Okay, this might be off topic, but what is when you see a disease that sometimes is referred to as what's the word? Syndrome. Like a syndrome and a disease are used interchangeably. For example,
yeah, go ahead.
Raynaud's syndrome disease.
It's a great question. I don't know. My guess might be that with a syndrome, we don't necessarily understand the underlying causality of it. That might be my guess as to what the difference would be. But that's a great question. I don't have a good answer for that. But my completely guess, but at least an educated guess, with that typically with a syndrome, we probably don't fully appreciate or understand the underlying causality. But that's a shot in the dark. I'm totally guessing.
Okay. But doesn't syndrome mean like genetic disease? And
it doesn't always have to mean a genetic disease, and even that's tricky because there are a lot of diseases that have a genetic predisposition, right? Well, there's some diseases that absolutely, Tay-Sachs is a great example, 100% genetic disease. Daniel's got an answer for us, so hold on a second. So some diseases are 100% genetic. Others are diseases that have a genetic predisposition, meaning if you have a gene, you're more likely to have it. Breast cancer, there are certain breast cancers that have a genetic predisposition for, but just because you have that gene doesn't mean you're going to get it. Daniel, by all means, shed light on this for us.
So I just pulled this out of my physician's reference manual, my PDR physician's desk reference, and it says that a syndrome is a group of symptoms which consistently occur together, or a condition characterized by a set of associated symptoms.
No.
So if you take something like metabolic syndrome is often characterized by a set of different illnesses. Like it could be you could have liver failure and diabetes. Well, diabetes in itself is a disease, but combined, they're a metabolic syndrome.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yulia, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I have a question. I am someone who's very, very skeptical of alternative medicine. And for some people who like super strongly believe that this works and that works and they should put essential oils on it, I feel like there's more than placebo that plays an effect. Do you know anything about why people are helped by their cures that have been either not proven or even proven to be harmful, like why they continue helping people?
Okay, so here are the two things that I will say without getting too far down the rabbit hole. The first thing that I would say is that a lot of what we don't know about holistic medicine is because it isn't studied. I think one of the really interesting things that I think we are experiencing right now is we are seeing science in action. Never before in the history of mankind have we had not only just an illness like this, but because of social media, because of the immediacy of information, we are seeing science in action, how science works. One of the things that just completely irritated me to no end was how the previous administration was railing on the doctors, how they would say one thing one week and then their next 2 weeks later, right? Well, Fauci said this 6 months ago and now he's saying something different now. Well, that's exactly what scientists do. Scientists study things, and as they study things, they adjust their understanding of it based on that. So that's what science is. It's about learning and exploring and understanding. And one of the reasons we're able to see it occur so immediately here is because the coronavirus is so devastating and dangerous that they're throwing a massive amount of money at it. This, there's a lot of people who've been skeptical of the vaccines because they were done so fast. The technology to make them this fast has always been there. The difference is it's made by pharmaceutical companies that are interested in profits. So for a pharmaceutical company, they've got to decide they want to explore the vaccine for this particular disease and hope that they beat somebody else to it. And if they don't feel they can beat somebody else to it, they're not going to put the money into it and all those types of things. So we're seeing this here. And what's the first thing they said about it? Don't give it to anybody under 16. Don't give it to pregnant people. Is that because it's dangerous to pregnant people? Does it mean it's dangerous to kids? No, we just haven't studied it yet. As much as we've studied it, we haven't studied those things yet. And so some holistic medicines that may have some benefits to them may just simply be because there's not the interest in studying those things for those things. I mean, if you think about it, things like aspirin that came from wormwood and things along those lines, there are things that have been picked up over the years. There are still pharmaceutical companies sending people off into, the rainforest to find new chemicals that might have some type of an effect on us. So there isn't as much research and money into those things now. However, the second thing that I would say is I think you're underselling the placebo effect. The placebo effect is one of the things that they've been studying more and more is just how incredibly powerful the placebo effect is. The placebo effect is very powerful. In fact, if you look at some of the common medicines that we have now, the rigors that are necessary, the standards that we set for a medicine now, for how, whether or not it is better than placebo, some of our earliest medicines wouldn't crack that criteria right now, because it's a great, interesting field of study, placebo effect, because it is incredibly powerful. So I would say it's both of those things. Maybe there's something to it, maybe there's not. But whether there's merits or not, the fact that you believe it helps is a huge thing for a lot of people.
Yep. Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Now, when diagnosing these diseases by these signs and symptoms, we, of course, are looking to see if these things are local or systemic. What does it mean to be local?
Specific to one area?
Yeah. If when class is done today, you're excited for the weekend, so you're going to drive to the coast so you can hide by yourself on the beach. And as you're skipping to your car, you roll your ankle. By the time you get to the beach, your ankle's the size of a grapefruit, but has your hand changed size at all? No, it's going to be a local effect. Whereas sometimes if you get a fever, especially you see this with little kids, when a little kid gets a fever, their whole body warms up. You can feel it off of any part of their body. You can cook eggs on their back, right, from that fever that kicks in from that time. So again, things can be local or they can be systemic. However, while diseases and disorders are one of the major causes of homeostatic imbalances, what is the other major cause of homeostatic imbalance that we are all coping with right now? Exactly. Aging. Excellent. In fact, that's how we define aging. Aging is a progressive decline in our ability to restore homeostasis. All right, give me some examples.
Bone density?
Bone density, absolutely. Right? Did you know you can actually hold a newborn baby at chest height, drop them, and they will actually bounce right back into your arms?
No.
Okay, no, that's not really true. Don't do that. Don't drop babies. All right, but however, while you should not drop babies, are there instances of babies rolling off of changing tables?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And are the babies typically injured when that happens?
Yeah, it depends on
They
where you
may
have your
cry,
changing
but
table.
their bones are pretty much rubbery at that point, right? If you hold grandma at chest height and drop her, is she going to bounce back into your arms? Or if grandma rolls off the changing table, does she bounce on the floor without any harm? Yeah. Grandma shatters when she hits the ground. Absolutely. Bone density is a huge one. Give me another example.
Metabolism.
Metabolism, absolutely. Grandma's always cold, no matter what the temperature is, right? Who was it earlier that said they kept their house at like 82, oh no, 69 or something like that, right? Grandma would hate that, right? She'd have 87 blankets on top of her as a result of that. So homeostasis, maintaining body temperature is a huge issue. What else? Give me at least one more good one.
I really want to say menopause, but I don't think that has more to do with the reproductive system.
Yeah, I
maintaining
think
it. So I don't think that was one.
Immune
system?
Sure, immune system. Right. Who are we vaccinating first? The elderly, who have a harder time with it producing an aggressive response to maintaining protection of our body from viruses and things along those lines. Absolutely. So all of these things, balance, flexibility. Right? You used to be able to do those back arches, or you can do the splits while you're doing your WAP dance or all those kind of things. But grandma, right? How many grandmas on TikTok do you see doing the WAP dance? Not too many, right? Because they have a harder time getting down into those splits as a result of that, right? Yeah, and don't even get us started on memory. Absolutely. Brain function. All these things change dramatically as we age.
What about like
elasticity of skin is a great example.
That was,
right?
yeah.
I pick up my kids by the scruff of the neck and carry them around the house. And by the time that Child Protective Services gets here, right, it's gone back into place. They have that elasticity, right? You pick grandma by the scruff of the neck and try to carry her around, and the skin just rips off, right? So yeah, absolutely. So all of those are great examples. Perfect. All right. Questions on any of that? All right. With that, we are done with our introduction. So I will ask one more time loudly and certainly, is there anybody left who has not filled out the attendance quiz? Going once, going twice, sold. All right, here is the plan. We are going to switch gears and start building that foundation we talked about by talking chemistry first. During the break, I will check the attendance quiz and see if I'm able to add anybody. Like last time, I will, so let's go ahead and do this. Stop sharing that. I will pause this. Okay, why are they so stable though? You're absolutely right, but what is it about them that makes them so stable?
Because they form 4 bonds and they have no extra valence electrons.
Excellent. Carbon can form 4 covalent bonds. And because of that, it allows it to form big, large, functional, large, complex, and stable molecules. And thank you for the reminder about the recording. And again, they're functional groups, things like hydroxyl groups or amine groups or things on those lines. I'm not making you memorize those. Should you know what a hydroxyl group is, probably at this point in your life. But again, if you want to memorize all the functional groups of organic compounds, then take organic chemistry. But what we do need to talk about is what they're able to form. So again, we do have a list of them in your textbook. But when dealing with these organic compounds, basically, they're organized by their structure. A monomer is a building block. It is the simplest basic of these units. It's like a blue square Lego, right? It's the building block that you're going to use to make everything else. If you then put 10 of them together into a big long line, what would you have then?
The polymers.
Right, exactly. A big long line of 10 of those put together would be a polymer. However, if you're really going to build something with Legos, you're not reliant on just dealing with blue square Legos. Hold on a second. Looks like someone's having trouble getting back into the lecture. So you can just send them the direct link for that and that should work. All right. Right. So you don't have to just do it with blue squares. We can, you've got the orange rectangles and all sorts of other ones that can go together and you have your big, huge, massive, complex macromolecules. All right. So that's our goal, is to talk about these types of things. Now, when building our body, having these macromolecules is vitally important because the structure of them determine the function of our body. And as we talked about, those two things go hand in hand. So when we're making the structures of the body, there are basically 4 main types of macromolecules that we use. What are they?
Proteins, lipids.
Well, hold on, let's slow down. So you got, I heard lipids. Let's start with that one. Lipids. What's lipids a fancy way of saying? Fat. All right, those are our fats. Excellent. Then you said proteins. What's protein a fancy way of saying? No, proteins are just proteins. What else?
Carbohydrates.
Carbohydrates, which is a fancy way of saying, where are the carbohydrates?
Energy.
True, in the form of what? Sugar. There you go, exactly. Sugars. And then what is the 4th macromolecule? There you go, nucleic acids. So there you go. All of the structures of your body are primarily made up of these 4 main types of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So let's talk about these, starting first with carbohydrates. As we talked about, these are what we commonly refer to as our sugars. And as being our sugars, they have lots of important functions. But what would you say are the 2 most important functions of carbohydrates?
Energy source and building.
Energy, absolutely. Energy is absolutely one of them, right? They're a primary source of energy. Many of you had a big, huge bowl of carbohydrates this morning for breakfast, probably in the form of a potato or some cereal or something along the lines. But excellent, as Madison pointed out, there's also structure, right? While many of you had a big bowl of carbohydrates this morning, that big bowl of carbohydrates wasn't probably a big bowl of your backyard lawn, right? A blade of a blade of grass has a massive number of sugars in them. However, those sugars are not in a form that we can easily use, we can process, right? Are there structures, are there organisms that can use the carbohydrates out of that grass?
Yes.
Yeah, like what?
Cows.
Cows, right? And cows have something like 87 different stomachs that allow them to be able to eat the grass. Or a sheep, right? If you think about it, a sheep and a wolf are about the same size. But the digestive system of the sheep is 2.5 times longer than that of the wolf. Because what does the sheep eat?
Grass.
Grass. What does the wolf eat?
Meat.
Meat, exactly. Yeah, it eats the sheep. Exactly. It eats meat. Meat, the protein is much easier to break down, whereas that grass is much more complicated. So sugars are used for energy and for our structure. Now, there are lots of different types of carbohydrates, but one of the primary characteristics of most carbohydrates is that in general, they are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And most importantly, they have a 2-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. Again, the advantage of this is they have a lot of bonds to them, and they'll give them a lot of structure, and bonds, of course, as we know, store energy. Now, when dealing with organic organisms like this, when we talk about carbohydrates, there are 3 major groups of carbohydrates, and they're all based pretty much on size. The first are our monosaccharides. These include things like glucose and fructose and galactose and ribose and deoxyribose. All of these are basically, and here I'll just draw them simply. They're, oops, if I have the right color. They're either 5 or 6 carbon rings. So notice here, you would have a carbon at each of these 6 corners, and that would be an example, or you can have a 5 carbon ring as well. And of course, as we mentioned, they'll have a numerous functional groups coming off of these, like maybe they'll have a hydroxyl group hanging out over here or something like that. But they're going to have 5 or 4 carbons, 5 or 6 carbons working together to form some type of ring. Again, these are our blue square Legos. These are our building blocks. And because they have so many bonds, these are the things that we break down for energy. Every time we break one of these bonds, we release that energy and we are able to do work. Right? However, if these are building blocks, then we need to be able to put them together. And when we put them together, or specifically put 2 of them together, we get what we call disaccharides. Now, disaccharides occur in one of 2 ways. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit and just draw these as squares instead of hexagons because it'll save me time. But what happens is, for instance, we have 2 of these sugars here, and both of them will have a hydroxyl functional group on them. When it comes time to form a bond between these, what happens is when we bring these 2 things together, and again, I'll cheat and just draw it up here at the top. Yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't able to add anybody today, but stick around and I'll do the best that I can to add somebody on Tuesday. When I form a bond between these 2, basically what holds them together is a single oxygen. So notice during that process, we lose a hydrogen and an oxygen and another hydrogen. Dihydrous monoxide is formed in this process. And what's the other name we have for dihydrous monoxide?
Water.
Water. Exactly. So notice when we form this bond between them, we draw water out of it, which is why it's called dehydration synthesis. Of course, that means if we're going to split this bond, then that means we need to use water to break it apart. And so, of course, the breaking of this bond is hydrolysis. And again, I know I've cheated by doing a real simple drawing of this, but here's some pretty pictures that show this process as well. Notice our glucose and our fructose both have a hydroxyl group. Water is pulled out of this, and as that water is pulled out of this, we get our dehydration synthesis. Conversely, if we want to break that sucrose up, we use the water, and we can break that bond back into the glucose and the fructose. And this is exactly how it works. We take these monosaccharides together and put them together, and we can form all sorts of different disaccharides. And some of the more important ones let's talk about You put a glucose and a fructose together and you get sucrose. Sucrose is a super important sugar. Where might you find that super important sugar we call sucrose?
Table sugar?
Table sugar, exactly. So it's sitting in the middle of your table, or most importantly, it's sitting at a Starbucks, ready for you to pour it into your coffee. All right. You take a glucose and a galactose together and you get lactose. Where might you find that?
Milk.
Milk, absolutely. You find that in milk, absolutely. In your refrigerator, or conveniently enough, also sitting at Starbucks, helping you to be able to do that. However, probably the most vital disaccharide for human existence. You take two glucoses and put them together and you make a maltose. And what makes maltose so vital for human life? Come on, I know somebody here knows. Thanks to the coronavirus, many of you probably knows. What do you use maltose to do?
Taste?
Saliva?
Not close, getting closer. You use maltose to malt barley. And why do you malt barley?
Alcohol.
To make beer?
There you go, to make beer, exactly. You use it to make beer. There you go. So, again, vital for human existence. All right. Now, these disaccharides and monosaccharides are what we call our simple sugars. Because they're small, they're not very complicated, and like I said, while they're big building blocks, they're also very easy to break down to get energy from. However, it's also like having money in your pocket, right? If you have that $20 bill, that $20 bill can sit in your pocket for weeks. However, it seems like the second you break it, then all the little money disappears, right? It's gone instantly. So you need that big chunk of it to be able to save. And we do the same thing in living things as well. We take all these sugars and put them into a larger, more stable structure for storage or for structure, and we call those polysaccharides. Again, we just finished talking about the difference between a potato and a blade of grass. In a potato, there is a massive amount of carbohydrates stored in them. And what is the molecule that is storing all of those in our plant, in that potato?
Starch.
Starch, absolutely. However, that blade of grass also has a lot of carbohydrates, but what form is it stored in?
Cellulose.
Cellulose, absolutely. Cellulose, right? Basically, it's stored in a different form. The starch is the one that is used for energy, and cellulose is the one that is used for structure. This one is much easier broken down, but the way that the bonds are formed with cellulose, it forms structure. Excellent. So which of these two, so that's in plants, and what about animals like us? Do we store it as starch or do we store it as cellulose?
Glycogen.
Yeah, exactly. We store it as neither in animals. In animals, we store it as glycogen. You are absolutely correct. Every single cell in your body has stored glycogen in it. But I can think of two types off the top of my head that have a massive amount of glycogen inside of them. Give me an example of a cell or an organ in your body that would have a lot of glycogen in it.
Liver.
Liver, absolutely, right? Again, we are not constantly eating, but we constantly need glucose. So our liver stores a massive amount of glycogen that it can release into the blood as needed. Where else might we have a tremendous amount of glycogen?
Your blood cells?
Not a bad guess. Blood cells need to carry glycogen to what certain cells, but what cells are going to use it? Muscles, there you go. Muscle, especially skeletal muscle. Massive amount of glycogen, need that big fuel source so we can produce those big, powerful contractions. All right, so there you go. There are carbohydrates. Certainly useful, important, not terribly interesting. So let's talk about something a little more fun. Something a little bit more fun are our lipids. Now, lipids are similar to carbohydrates in that they're made up of carbon, they're made up of hydrogen, and they're made up of oxygen. However, the big difference between carbohydrates and lipids is carbohydrates do not have, lipids do not have that 2-to-1 ratio that carbohydrates have. Lipids have far fewer oxygen molecules in them, or oxygen atoms. Why is that important that they have fewer oxygen? What did you learn about oxygen in chemistry class? What do you know about oxygen?
It's a little bit harder to make bonds with.
Well, is it necessarily hard to make bonds with the oxygen?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
But
Normally, when a covalent bond is formed, the two atoms share electrons, right? And when it comes to sharing, how good is oxygen at sharing?
Not very
it's
good.
not caring.
Yeah, it's not very good. It tends to be very greedy. It tends to hold the electrons closer to it. That's one of the things that makes water so magical. Water has a polarity to it because oxygen holds the electrons closer to it, giving it a partial negative charge. The hydrogens get a partial positive charge. That's why it expands when it freezes. That's why it hurts when you do your belly flop, right? Oxygen doesn't share nicely. And so it forms polar bonds. However, with lipids having much less oxygen, they have far fewer polar covalent bonds, and so they are hydrophobic. They don't like water, right? And again, you may never have thought of these in these terms, but I absolutely positively know you're aware of it, because at lunchtime today, when you reach in the fridge and grab that Italian dressing for your salad, what's the first thing you do?
Shake it up.
Shake it. Why do you shake it up?
Because of the oil.
It's separated.
Yeah, the oil and the water are separated from each other. Absolutely. Because fats don't like water. Water don't like fats. So they separate from each other. So that's one of the big things with lipids. Lipids are hydrophobic. Now, there are many types of lipids. I'm not going to list them all because it would take the rest of the class, but I do want to talk about some of the more important ones. The first and by far most common lipid found in the body is a triglyceride. This is also what we refer to as neutral fat. And triglycerides, as the name indicates, basically what we have is an alcohol, in this case in the form of glycerol, and 3 fatty acids that attach to it. Now, again, I'm not going to make you draw the chemical composition of a triglyceride here so that you need to know all of the bonds. But we do need to talk a little bit about these fatty acids a little bit, that there are 3 of. The advantage of these fatty acids, and let's go ahead and do this on the whiteboard because I think this will be easiest to see. The advantage of a fatty acid, and I'm going to totally cheat here. These fatty acids have massive numbers of carbons and hydrogens on them, so it has a massive number of bonds. And as we know, breaking bonds gives us energy. So basically what we have is all these carbons in a row. Oops. And each of them have a bond with each other. It's so much easier with just a marker on the board. And as we know, each carbon needs to be able to make 4 bonds. So pretend these were all the same length and looked right and natural and whatever. And then on all of these, we would then have hydrogens. You get the idea. I'm not going to keep drawing them because it'll take forever, but you get the idea. We have this big, huge, long line of carbon and hydrogens, which all share nicely with each other. So we have this big, huge line of non-polar bonds. And so again, big chunk of hydrophobic components. Now, in this drawing that I've drawn here, what we have is all of the carbons will have the maximum number of hydrogens attached to them. And how would we describe a fatty acid that had the maximum number of hydrogens attached to them that they could?
Saturated.
There you go, exactly. I know most of you have heard that term saturated fat before, but you may not have fully appreciated what it meant. Saturated fat means that a fatty acid chain has all of the possible hydrogens that it possibly could. Now, the other thing that can happen, and I'll just do a small chain here so that we can see this, is that what can happen is two of these carbons can actually form a double bond with each other. When they form a double bond with each other, if you think about it, this one gets its 4, this one gets its 4 bonds, but these already have 3. So this one only can get 1 more, and this one can only get 1 more. Notice in that case, in this case, we have 1 double bond. So with this 1 double bond, we would call this a what? Again, I know you know. What would we call this fatty acid that had a double bond and wasn't saturated with hydrogens?
Unsaturated fat.
An unsaturated fat, excellent. We get partial credit for that. Fatty acid. However, in this case, it just has 1 double bond. So really, it's only missing a couple hydrogens. So we would call it what type of unsaturated fat?
Polyunsaturated.
Well, with 1, it would be a
Mono.
mono. A mono unsaturated fat. But you absolutely have the right idea. If we had one that had 2 double bonds, then in that case, we would indeed have a polyunsaturated fat. Now, again, I've done a horrible job of drawing these, so let's just pretend that they never exist, that it never happened. But let's look at this pretty picture instead. Notice here, we see indeed 2 completely saturated fatty acids, where here with a double bond, we have a mono unsaturated fatty acid. Now notice that double bond does one other thing as well. It causes the fatty acid to kink, which again, probably isn't something you have thought about, but I know it's something you know. Because how do you typically tell the difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat? Give me an example of a saturated fat.
Butter,
Butter. Give me an example of an unsaturated fat.
vegetable oil.
Vegetable oil.
Olive oil.
Olive oil. Both are good examples. How do you know one is saturated, one is unsaturated?
Solid at room temp was saturated.
Exactly. Notice when the fatty acids are all straight, they tend to align more readily, and they're more likely to be solid at room temperature, like butter, like lard. Whereas things like olive oil, canola oil, things along those lines, because they're kinked, they don't line up as well, and so they tend to be more liquid at room temperature. And from a dietary standpoint, which ones are better for you?
Unsaturated.
Unsaturated fats, exactly. Excellent. So again, notice with all these massive number of bonds, these are a huge source of energy, a huge source of fuel. Very, very useful, very, very helpful. Again, I'm not going to make you memorize them, but notice whether it is a diagram, whether it's an illustration, symbolic, we can see that bend, we can see that kink, we can see that double bond. So trans-saturated fats are ones where we have more hydrogens on them. So again, we'll get into that more when we get to the dietary system. But again, useful, important. We use it for storage. We use it for insulation, right? Where do we tend to store our triglycerides?
Liver.
Okay, liver can be one of the places, although it's not very good to stare at there. But right, our adipose tissue, our fat, our subcutaneous fat, right, in our belly and our breasts and places like that as well. We store those, providing that insulation, providing that source for energy. Again, very useful, very important, not terribly interesting. Let's talk about a lipid that is much more interesting, and that is a phospholipid. Now, one of the first things you should notice about a phospholipid is, again, it still has an alcohol. It still has fatty acids. However, notice it only has 2, where a triglyceride has 3. But the other big thing about a phospholipid is a phospholipid has a big, huge polar head. And being polar, it allows this to interact with water and the stuff dissolved in water. Where might having something like a phospholipid be useful then, if it allows it to interact with water?
Around a
When
cell.
washing dishes.
Yeah, okay, true, and washing dishes as well. But I was thinking more from a biological standpoint. Absolutely, a cell. When we draw a cell, we think of it as this line that we draw, boom, there is my cell. But as we know, cells are surrounded by water. And since cells are surrounded by water, what we can do is we can take these phospholipids and line them up so that the head points out so that it can interact with the water and the stuff dissolved in water. And then those 2 fatty acid tails can point inward, helping to form a barrier that keeps the water out of the cell. Perfect. Any problems with that? No one has a problem with that?
Don't you need one on the other side for the inside of the cell?
Why? Is there water inside a cell?
Yeah.
Oh, shucks, you're right. Okay, yes, you're right. There's water inside cell. That means that what we do instead is we have the head pointing inward and then the tails pointing outward. All right, does that resolve it? No, because we still have the water outside as well. So what do? Do we alternate them? Have one going where its head points out and the other with its head pointing in? How do we resolve this issue if we have water both inside and outside?
Their tails will face each other. So like the one on the outside will face towards the inside and the one on the inside will face towards the outside. That's like the best way I could explain it to you.
No, you're absolutely correct, except for the one part you left out a little bit is you've got the key, though. You're absolutely right, is that we don't have one layer of them. We have 2 layers of them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What we actually have is a phospholipid bilayer, where you are absolutely correct. Heads out, tails in. We've got one row where the tails are pointing inward, and then the head is out, and then the other row, the head is in and the tails are out. And in that case, water is able to interact with the wall of the cell on the inside. Water and stuff dissolved in water can interact with the cell on the outside, but in between, we have this nice fatty acid core that is water phobic, hydrophobic, and helps to form a protective barrier. And so that's exactly what happens. And again, if you don't like my art, then here is a simple picture showing that same thing. Water can interact with the polar head, but cannot not interact with the tails. So we form a boundary, but that boundary can interact with water both outside and inside the cell. So as we'll see, and when we get to the cells, we'll spend even more time talking about the plasma membrane of that cell. That thing we draw just as a line around the cell, there is a tremendous amount of stuff going on with it. And the majority of it is this here. Now then, triglycerides and phospholipids are not the only types of lipids. Like I said, there are lots of them. Another very common lipid is this fellow right here, cholesterol. Notice cholesterol is made up of 4 carbon rings and several functional groups that come off of it. Now, I know when most people think of cholesterol, they think of cholesterol as being bad. They want to boo it, grab their pitchforks and their torches and come after cholesterol because it hurts you. But as we'll learn, cholesterol is very important for the function of the cell, and it has many other important functions as well. One thing that it's used is used to make our bile salts. Bile salts help us to digest the fats that we eat, helping us to break those fats down. But one of the most important things that cholesterols are used for is they're used to make some of our hormones, our chemical signals that are used to communicate with other cells. And those hormones made from cholesterol are called steroids. Here's two of them right here. Let me move the cameras out of the way a little bit so we can see them clearly. Notice these two are essentially identical. There are some very minor differences in their functional groups, but for the most part, they're identical. That must mean that they must be very similar hormones as well, correct? Yeah, exactly. One of them is indeed estrogen and the other one is testosterone, which we have no problem mixing up in the body. You can use one on Monday and the other on Tuesday, and they essentially do the exact same things in our body, right? All right, this is the part where you guys enthusiastically say no.
No.
No, of course not. Estrogen is what turns girl people into women people. Testosterone is what turns boy people into men people. So they are dramatically different from each other. And so while they look very similar, notice those subtle differences, those subtle changes have dramatic impacts on how they influence the body. All right. Now, there are plenty more different types of protein, lipids, and even combination lipids, like lipoproteins. One of the issues we have is we need to move these fats throughout our body, right? And if you think about it, do you want to take a whole bunch of fat and just pour it into our blood vessels and let it get to where it needs to go? Is that what you do with your bacon in the morning after making a big, huge, skillet full of bacon? You just take it and pour it down the sink and hope for the best?
No.
No, because it clogs it up, right? Well, our blood is filled with water and our our lipids don't like water. So what we do is we take lipids that need to be transported and we bundle them together into these big, massive balls, and then we put water-soluble proteins on the outer surface. Basically, it's got a candy-coated shell of proteins that allows it to dissolve in water so that it can be easily transported. Again, as I mentioned, I'm not going to list off all the different types of lipids, but as we come across lipids during the process of 430 and 431, as we talk about different ones, we'll talk more and more about the different styles and types of lipids and the functions they have. All right, questions on that? All right, excellent. And again, your book's got a nice table that talks about some of the different hormones and what their the different lipids and the functions of those. So you've got that there as well. However, what we probably want to talk the most about in this class are proteins. Proteins are made up of building blocks like all of our macromolecules. In this case, the building blocks are amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids. And am I going to make you memorize the names and the functional groups of all 20 amino acids?
Probably.
No, I'm not that mean. Again, chemistry is not worth it. But again, will there be a class? Yeah, take biochemistry or something like that, and you'll have to learn that. No, I don't care that you memorize the names of amino acids and their functional groups, but know that their amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And one of the big differences between proteins and carbohydrates and proteins and lipids is that they also contain carbon, they also contain hydrogen, they also contain oxygen, but proteins contain nitrogen. Now, proteins make up about 20% of your body weight. Now, on the surface, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, until I remind you that you are 60% of your body weight, water. That means you're only 20% stuff. And of the 20% stuff, 40% stuff. And of the 40% stuff that you are, half of that is proteins. Okay, so yeah, chemistry, yeah, okay, you needed to know them, but we got no cheat sheets in this class, but you don't have to memorize them either. Yes, there's a couple hands raised. Go ahead.
That's different for each person though, right? Like 60% water, 40% stuff. It
Yeah,
varies.
absolutely. Yes. Every person is different. In fact, males are typically different from females. It's a generalization, but the point being that close to half of the actual physical things that make up your body are proteins. So the
I know,
point,
like,
you don't
sorry.
have to memorize these numbers. These aren't numbers that are necessarily useful for anything important. I mean, I guess the one thing they're good for is you saddle up to a woman at a bar and you look at her in the eye and you say, hey, did you know that your body is 12 to 18% proteins? And they just swoon when you say that. But other than that, again, these numbers are big generalizations. The
I'm just
point I'm
curious
trying to
because I
emphasize.
was asking just because you know those bodybuilders who dehydrate themselves and they're like super low percent body fat. So I'm
Oh yeah,
curious.
yeah, sure, absolutely, yes. So yes, absolutely. But yeah, and obviously everybody's different in that as well. So great question. I provide study guides for the lab stuff. So for instance, when we get to the tissues, I will give you a precise list of which tissues you're going to be responsible for the lab exam and what information you need to know for those tissues. As I mentioned, for instance, like the directional terms and the regional terms of the body, I'm not giving you a study guide for that because you need to know all of them. So if I'm filtering a list, then I will provide the list so that you know precisely what you need. But I don't do lecture study guides because what I find is if I do a lecture study guide, then what students do is only study the study guide, which means I have to put everything that I said in lecture on the study guide, which means I'm rewriting my lectures, and I don't like to do that. You are responsible for everything we talk about in the class. When I filter information, I provide that for you. But all these things you need to know. But again, numbers like this aren't important. Will there be numbers that are going to be important in the class? Absolutely. The fact that your body's 60% water, do you need to know that precise number? No, because probably, especially in a class this small, nobody in here probably is exactly 60% water, right? Are we more water than stuff? Yeah. And is that useful to know? Sure. But numbers are not, when we get to numbers that are important, I will absolutely positively tell you that. Somebody else raised their hand? Yes. Arabic?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what about sulfur? We don't count it as a part of amino acid?
So there are some that have them. Again, there are other elements in these amino acids, but these are the four main ones that make them up. So they're not solely comprised of this, but these are by far the main ones.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Now, as I mentioned, proteins not only are the most numerous of the macromolecules that we have in the body, but they're the most diverse. Diverse in their structure. And since they're diverse in their structure, they're also the most diverse in their function. Because as we talked about, structure affects function. Function affects structure. And proteins is a great place where we see this. The most common protein in the body, if you were to reach into your body and randomly pull out a protein, the most common protein found in your body is a protein called collagen. And if you were to look at collagen under a microscope, what you would see is it is basically made up of 3 coiled strands. I'm going to just draw them side by side like this. But these 3 coiled strands basically are interwoven with each other in a rope-like structure. And that rope-like feature is what gives it its structure, gives it its integrity. Now, again, I have to work on my examples because normally I'm doing this in the classroom, but normally this is the point in time where I divide my hand down the middle and say, all right, everybody on this side of the room get on one side, everybody on this side of the room get on the other side. I would throw out a rope and you guys would spend a half an hour playing tug of war. And as big and strong and healthy and fit as all of you are, with half of you on one side of that rope and half of you on the other, as you guys pulling as hard as you possibly can because you get 100 points of extra credit for winning, as strong as you guys are you guys going to be able to tear that rope in half? What do you think? No. No, of course not, right? Because it resists those shearing forces. It resists that shearing, that tearing force, but not from rigidity. Once you guys are done, I can roll it up into a ball and I can toss it into the trunk of my car. And that's basically what collagen does, right? Collagen in your skin is what allows you to give your little sister an Indian burn without tearing the skin off of her, right? Collagen is what they inject into your lips to make them bigger and fuller, but not rigid, because everybody wants to have lips like Angelina Jolie or whoever has big lips now. Right? Collagen is a big, important structural protein. This is very different from another important protein, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is actually made up of 4 globular strands of proteins. And at the center of these 4 strands is a small group called a heme group. And in that heme group, we happen to have an iron. And what does that iron in the hemoglobin do?
Holds on to oxygen.
Yeah, it binds reversibly to oxygen, allowing us to transport oxygen in our body. In fact, something like 98% of the oxygen that is transported by your blood is attached to the hemoglobin. All right. A single hemoglobin, notice, has 4, we'll talk about that in a second, Amanda. That's a great question. Has 4 binding sites to it. A single red blood cell has something like 250 million hemoglobin inside of it. All right. So again, that single red blood cell can carry a massive amount of oxygen. And that binding of the oxygen to the iron is what gives it its red coloration. Now, you're right. Collagen is what gives our skin its resistance to shearing and shredding. There is also, as Maria pointed out, elastic fibers in the skin that are what allow it to stretch. But just like a rubber band, are there limits to how far I can stretch something like that? Yeah, the skin is the same way. So when the skin expands tremendously and rapidly, like for instance in pregnancy for some women, or another great example, my brother-in-law, his senior year of high school grew 12 inches. 1 year of high school, he grew 12 inches. And not surprisingly, he actually has stretch marks on his side from that incredibly rapid growth over a very short period of time. So yeah, like all of these things, there's a limit to its resistance. There's a limit to it. And instead of you guys pulling on the 2 ends of the rope, if I connected the 2 ropes to, I don't know, bull elephants or something like that, might there be enough force where eventually they would tear the rope in half? Yeah, absolutely. There are going to be limits to all of those things. Absolutely. And yeah, so elastin's another example, an elastic structural protein. However, probably one of the most important types of proteins found in the body are enzymes. Enzymes are, of course, biological catalysts. What does it mean to be a catalyst?
Increase the rate of reaction.
Yeah, it increases the rate of a chemical reaction, absolutely. But now, one of the things that we're always careful about in a biology class, especially anatomy and physiology, is saying always or saying never. Right? We try not to say always, we try not to say never, because there seems to always be exceptions. However, here's a classic example. Every single chemical reaction that has been studied in the human body has an enzyme that makes it faster. That doesn't mean every chemical reaction that takes place in the body uses an enzyme, but every chemical reaction in the body that has been studied, there's an enzyme that facilitates it, that can make it faster. I'm sure at some point someone will find a chemical reaction that takes place in the body that there isn't an enzyme that helps with, but it hasn't been found yet. So it's this crazy thing, vitally important for our existence, these enzymes. And again, some of them are as basic as lactase. What does lactase let you do?
It's just lactose.
Yeah, it makes you break that bond in the lactose, breaking that disaccharide into 2 monosaccharides, right? If you don't make lactase, or the lactase you produce is in an inactive or inefficient form, what do we say about you?
Lactose intolerant?
Yeah, you're lactose intolerant, right? And if you're lactose intolerant, should you be eating 3 scoop ice cream sundaes?
I mean, you can, but you're not
You
going to feel
can,
good.
but yeah, you're going to be miserable afterwards. Absolutely. Yeah, again, you can push through. Absolutely, you can push through, but you will pay for it usually. Absolutely. Or you could take the enzyme or something along those lines. But that's the point, right? Not allowing you to eat too much ice cream isn't the worst thing that has ever happened to a person. But obviously, there are some other enzymes that, if they weren't functioning, would be vital, and it could be terminal, it could cause your death. Absolutely. So again, tremendous variety in the shape of proteins, which gives to their tremendous diverse function. Right? And again, it's one of the most important concepts we can learn in this class. The function of something is determined by its structure. Its structure determines the function. And we can see this and why it's so important in proteins. Now, this is going to take a little bit of work in our proteins. So actually, even though it's a teeny bit early, I think this is a good stopping point for our next break, because now things are going to get a teeny bit dense. So I want to come at it fresh. So let's go ahead and take our next break. I think we're still doing good on time. So we'll take another 15-minute break. So we will restart at 2:35. And I will start the recording at that point. I keep writing this, and eventually I'll stop making announcements and I'll remember to start the recording before I erase it. So thank you to those who have been reminding me. But any questions before we take this break? And then we'll come back and again, really dive into this on proteins of how the structure and the function go together. All right, see you guys in 15 minutes. Let's go ahead and get started again. So, as I mentioned, we are going to talk about proteins now. And as we mentioned, the structure of the proteins determine their function. So what we need to do is we need to talk a little bit about how we make proteins. Proteins, as we talked about, are made by a combination of amino acids. Here we have some basic amino acids with some type of functional group. And again, you don't have to memorize the types. You don't have to memorize their functional groups. Just know that they have them. And notice, again, we're going to do those same types of chemical reactions. Dehydration synthesis brings them together. Hydrolysis breaks them apart. However, when we do it with amino acids, we bring two amino acids together. We call that bond that forms between them a peptide bond. So when we use dehydration synthesis to form that bond between two amino acids, we call it a peptide bond. And that is the basis for our structure. When we talk about a list of proteins, when we talk about them, we talk about a group of proteins somewhere between dozens to thousands of amino acids put together. We form linear structures that are called polypeptides. And those polypeptides are what we use to make our proteins. There's basically 4 levels to the structural organization of a protein. When we talk about the structural organization of the protein, obviously the first thing is the sequence of amino acids themselves. Amino acid 1 plus amino acid 2 plus amino acid 3 plus amino acid 4, and so on and so forth. At its core, that is what a protein is, a sequence of amino acids. And this simple sequence of amino acids, we basically call, oops, where is it? Come on, there we go. The primary structure. So our primary structure is basically just the sequence of amino acids. Oh, keep forgetting I have my cap lock on. Now, does this sequence matter? Is it vitally important? If a protein is made up of thousands of amino acids, oops, does it really and truly matter what amino acid is right here? If I've got 3,000 amino acids in a sequence, does this one right here really and truly matter?
Yes.
Yeah, Turns out absolutely it does. Absolutely. In fact, many disorders, probably one of the most common is sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a disorder where the red blood cell, when it gets into a low pressure environment, the hemoglobin, remember we talked about the hemoglobin was globular? Well, what happens is the hemoglobin straightens out. And when it straightens out, it causes the cell to bulge, giving the cell kind of a sickle shape, a C shape. It can also cause this cell to rupture and burst, releasing all that hemoglobin. It can clog the capillaries, causing pain, causing blindness, causing all sorts of issues as a result of that. And that process, sickle cell anemia, is caused by a single change of a single amino acid on one protein. So absolutely, it absolutely matters, right? The vocabulary matters. So the structure, your starting point matters. And that is our primary structure. Now, the other important thing to remember about this structure is, remember, they have these functional groups. Oh, hold on, don't have my chat window up. Sickle cell anemia, no, is not an autoimmune disorder. It is actually a genetic disorder caused by a mutation in a gene where we make an inappropriate placement of an amino acid in there. So it is actually a genetic disorder. Now, again, you don't have to memorize amino acids. You don't have to memorize their functional groups. But one of the things that you should know about functional groups are some functional groups are positively charged. Some functional groups are negatively charged. And some functional groups don't have a charge at all. So Daniel, that's a great point. Yes, one of the interesting things about, well, I wouldn't say that it's a genetic adaptation, although I guess it is essentially. While sickle cell anemia, if you have two mutated genes, is definitely devastating disorder to have. What they found is if you have just one mutation of it, that it can make you more resistant to malaria and a couple other disorders as well. So that advantage that is incurred from that being one of the reasons why it has been so persistent in populations at such a higher rate than you would normally expect with recessive disorder. So you're absolutely correct. It does have a adaptive advantage, as it turns out, to that disorder. Yep. All right. So if we had two amino acids that had functional groups, one positive and one negative, what do we know about positive and negative things? Do they like each other or do they not like each other?
No.
Not like each other. If I have two magnets and I take the positive and the negative end, what happens? They like each other, absolutely. So those might like each other or come together. Whereas if I had two positives side by side, would those necessarily like each other? No, so those might move away from each other, whereas the positive and the negative might turn towards each other. These minor attractions form what we call, and I need to, well, let's just do this the easy way. I'll do that. These minor attractions that form cause what we call our secondary structures. Secondary structures are formed by the attraction and repulsion of the functional groups. And basically what forms here are hydrogen bonds. So these hydrogen bonds are vital for getting small portions formed by hydrogen bonds. Small portions of our sequence will form these patterns. Here we see two great examples of a couple patterns. We have an alpha helix and we have a beta sheet. So those are two examples of some of these secondary structures that can form by these hydrogen bonds that occur. And one of the keys to these is that these structures are local structures. So on a single strand of amino acids, I could get the case where I have an alpha helix coming here, and then a beta sheet forming here, and then another alpha helix there. So notice here I have 3 secondary structures on this one sequence of amino acids. So this is a secondary structure, this is a secondary structure, this is a secondary structure, and they're all formed by these hydrogen bonds. Now, obviously, when I take the thing in its entirety, then that's going to be its tertiary structure. The tertiary structure is basically, the 3-dimensional shape of the whole protein, of the whole sequence. So I've got an alpha helix, I've got a beta sheet, I've got an alpha helix, and together they make this U-shaped structure, the 3-dimensional shape of the whole sequence of amino acids. However, this by itself isn't a functional protein. Most proteins are made by 2 or more polypeptides coming together. Remember, we talked about how collagen is made up of 3 alpha helixes to go. We talked about how hemoglobin is 4 globular proteins bound together. And notice here with my one single polypeptide, what if I were to make another one? Maybe one more globular, and then maybe 2 more that were more angular. And when I take these and I put them all together, I now have a fully functional protein. And so when we put these polypeptides together, we get the quaternary structure. The quaternary structure is when we have those 2 or more polypeptides bound together to make the fully functional protein. All right.
Sorry, so the alpha helix and beta pleated sheets, those are in secondary structure or tertiary structure?
They are the secondary structures that then collectively make the tertiary structure.
Okay.
So yes, so again, if we looked at it, just this part right here, that there is an alpha helix. Again, I know I didn't do a good job of drawing it, but pretend that's an alpha helix. That right there, that portion in the box would be a secondary structure. This part here would be a secondary structure. This beta sheet here would be a secondary structure. But notice when I put those 3 secondary structures together, I get the tertiary structure. So the secondary structures are local effects, local shapes, whereas the tertiary structure is the whole shape of the sequence. Is the whole shape of the sequence. And then our quaternary shape is multiple sequences together. All right, so those are basically the 3 orders of the structural organization for our proteins. All right, now I'm gonna have to erase my clown head here for a second so that we can, come on. See the pretty pictures from the textbook. Again, here, notice we have some alpha helixes, some beta sheets all put together into a tertiary structure. We put them all together into a secondary structure. Into a quaternary structure by putting two of them together. And that is our fully functional protein with a specific structure and a specific function. Now, again, half an hour ago, I said structure and function go hand in hand. So on one point, it seems kind of pointless that we took the time to go through all of this. But the reason we went through all of this is because notice the true shape of our functional protein is due to the three-dimensional shape of its individual units. And the 3D shape of the individual units is due to these local relationships that are formed by hydrogen bonds. And what do we know about hydrogen bonds?
They're one of the strongest bonds.
Strongest bonds, hold things together, lock tight. Is that what hydrogen bonds do?
Well, I got that one wrong on the quiz.
Why? What did you say?
I think I put that the strongest bond was the covalent.
So then which one is the weakest?
The hydrogen bond.
Hydrogen bonds are the weakest bonds. They
Oh,
are.
so I got it right.
Yeah, there you go.
Cool. Okay, cool.
Hydrogen bonds are indeed the weakest bonds. In fact, hydrogen bonds are highly sensitive to what two things? Hydrogen bonds in particular are very sensitive to temperature, absolutely. Temp changes, and what's the other one?
Is it pH?
It's absolutely pH. So as your temperature changes, as the pH in your blood changes, those can potentially change these hydrogen bonds of the secondary structures of your proteins. And if those hydrogen bonds change, our secondary structure comes apart. That breaks up our three-dimensional structure, which breaks up our quaternary structure, and suddenly we have a non-functional protein. What do we call this process? I know you may never have thought about it in these terms before, but many of you experienced it precisely this morning. Because for this morning, what you did is you took an egg and cracked that egg into the frying pan. And it has a nice yolk and it has the whites. But when you first cracked it into the pan, is the white actually white? No. What causes it to become white? Maria's already stolen my answer for me, but what happens that causes the whiteness? Denatures, absolutely. Denaturation is that process where we break those hydrogen bonds, change the shape of the protein, and when we change the shape of the protein, we change its function. Right. Having a fever is a good thing if you are sick. It increases your metabolism. It causes your body to store things like zinc and iron that the viruses can use to replicate. But if your temperature gets too high, then what happens is your proteins start to denature. And remember, as I mentioned, there are those catalysts, those enzymes that are doing all those chemical reactions in your body. And if they start to change shape, your cells suddenly can't do all the chemical reactions they need to do, leading to cell death, leading to organ failure, leading ultimately to potentially death from that. And as we talked about, what are two of the things that we keep very tight control of homeostatically in our body? Temperature and pH of our blood. All right. So this blood the temperature, the pH, their proteins. It is vitally important that we understand the structural organization so we can understand how proteins work. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. So, and again, as we mentioned, denaturing distorts the shape, and if we change the shape, we change the function. And again, these are things you can experience for yourself. You can take a piece of white bread, take a paper towel, dry off your tongue, put that piece of white bread on your tongue and let it sit there. As your tongue produces saliva, it's going to mix with that bread. And in your tongue, you produce a enzyme called salivary amylase. And that salivary amylase starts to break down the carbohydrates in the bread. And as you sit there with it on your tongue, it will start to taste sweet as it starts to break down the sugars. Your tongue also produces an enzyme called lingual lipase. What do you think lingual lipase breaks down?
Fat.
Fats. Absolutely. So does that mean you could take a little cube of fat, stick it on your tongue, and it'll start to break it down, and you can taste the acid that is formed from all those fatty acids that are produced? No. Because what happens is that lingual lipase that your tongue produces is not in an active form when it's produced. So it can't work in your mouth. But then you swallow it, and suddenly when you swallow it into your stomach, it starts working. Why is that? Why doesn't it work in your mouth, but it does work in your stomach?
pH.
pH. What's the pH in your mouth?
Basic.
Yeah, well, 7, around 7, pretty neutral. What's the pH in your stomach?
3.
Yeah, 3, maybe 2, very acidic. So what happens is when that lingual lipase gets into your stomach, the pH causes it to change shape and suddenly becomes functional. So in that case, we're not denaturing it, we're actually changing the shape and making it functional. It's actually produced in a denatured state. So pH and temperature changes the shape of proteins, both for good and for bad. All right. Now, again, I keep talking about enzymes, and that is because enzymes are vitally, vitally important. They're proteins. They're catalysts. I know we mentioned this already, the biological catalysts. We talked about it lowering the activation energy, but what's the other characteristic of a catalyst? We said it makes a chemical reaction go faster. And again, as we mentioned, it does that by lowering the activation energy for it. But if I take oxygen and add it to a fire, that fire gets bigger. Does that mean oxygen is a catalyst for that fire? Andrew, you say no. Why not?
Because typically catalysts aren't used up in the reaction.
Bingo. That's the other big key definition to a catalyst, right? Oxygen would get used up when you add it to the fire. The key to a catalyst, to an enzyme, is they are unchanged by the chemical reaction. They're not used up. Not only are they not used up, but they're not changed by the chemical reaction at all. And that means we can use them many times. In fact, some of the chemical reactions some of the enzymes in your body can do as many as 2,000 chemical reactions in a second. Some of these things are incredibly efficient in how they're able to do that. Now, one of the keys to enzymes is they're highly specific. All right, as we talked about, lactase does one thing and one thing only. What was the one thing lactase does?
Breaks down like the lactose.
Yeah, it breaks down the lactose sugar, absolutely, right? Lipase does one thing. What's the one thing it does? Yeah, it breaks down fats, right? Notice enzymes typically have that suffix ase at the end of them. And what makes them highly specific is typically, and again, we'll deal with my drawing, they are big globular proteins But those big globular proteins have a very specific binding site, or what is called an active site. So we have this binding site or active site that is specific just for one chemical reaction. And again, they're proteins. So while they're highly efficient, like I said, we have some enzymes that can do as many as 2,000 chemical reactions in a second. We change the temperature, change the pH, we change those hydrogen bonds, and we can change their shape. We can change how efficient they are. I like the picture that your textbook gives us for this. It does a pretty decent job of illustrating our point here. Here we have a globular protein. Here we have a specific binding site. And in this case, it's for amino acids. 2 amino acids come in. It lowers the activation energy. We're able to form that peptide bond by dehydration synthesis. Our amino acids are now bound together, and our enzyme is unchanged by the process. I think this does a really nice job of illustrating our point. My only problem with it is it makes the enzyme seem very passive in the process. Let's take a molecular look, a more accurate molecular look at an enzyme. Here is another example of an enzyme. Notice again, it's a globular protein, and here in pink represents the active site or the binding site. Notice here when our 2 molecules come in and bind to it, and I'll write this out because it's very fun to say, because you can, again, this is one of those things you can call grandma. Say, hey, guess what, grandma? When 2 molecules bind to an enzyme, that enzyme undergoes a conformational change. It's a big fancy term. She'll be impressed. She'll send you 20 bucks in the mail. But what does it mean to undergo a conformational change?
A change in shape.
Exactly. All it means is it changes its shape. That's it. Undergoes a conformational change. It just means it changes shape. Notice when the 2 molecules bind to it, it changes its shape and it brings the 2 wings up. When it brings the 2 wings up, it brings the 2 molecules together, allowing a chemical reaction to take place. We get a new molecule as a result of that. But notice it then unfolds again and is completely the same as it was at the beginning. Notice our enzyme is again unchanged by the process, but you can see it can be very dynamic in that process. It's just not used up. It's not changed by the process. All
Is
right.
this process called something feet?
I'm sorry?
This process, is it the one that called, I don't know, something feet in the brackets?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the term associated with that, but I
Okay.
can't think of anything off the top of my head, but
Okay, that's
yep, sorry. All right. Excellent. So that is our proteins and what we need to know for them for now. That still leaves us one more macromolecule we need to talk about, and that last macromolecule are nucleic acids. All right. Carbohydrates are made up of simple sugars, monosaccharides and disaccharides, right? Are lipids made up of fatty acids and alcohols. Proteins made up of amino acids. Nucleic acids are also made up of a building block, and the building block for nucleic acids are what are known as nucleotides. And as you can see from this illustration, a nucleotide building block has 3 components to them. The first component, as you can see, actually I won't bother writing it because it says it right here, is a 5-carbon sugar. And it happens to come in 2 flavors. Anybody know the 2 5-carbon sugars that can be possibly used here? I know you know them. I just don't think you know them. Do you like that? Say that 5 times real fast.
Is one of them pentose?
Nope, not a bad guess because there's 5, so that's not a bad guess. It rhymes with it though.
Ribose and
There you go. One of them is indeed ribose. And if one of them is ribose, what do you think the other one is?
deoxyribose.
Deoxyribose. Right? Again, you know that because when I say nucleic acids, what do you guys think of? Yeah, DNA and RNA. Of course, remember in this class, spelling counts. So are we going to get away with just saying DNA and RNA? No. So what does DNA stand for?
Deoxynucleic acid.
Yeah, deoxyribonucleic acid. Exactly. Why is it deoxyribo? Because it's got the sugar deoxyribose. RNA is ribonucleic acid. Why? Because it has the sugar ribose. So yeah, again, I knew you knew it. You just didn't know you knew it. So there's 2 possible sugars we can have here, either a ribose or a deoxyribose. We're also going to have a phosphate group. This phosphate functional group, again, I'm not going to make you draw the molecular composition of it. However, one of the important things to know about it is a very negatively charged functional group. So it has a very, very negative charge to it. So we get one of those. And the third component is a nitrogen base. Now, again, many of you know this, may not know you know this, but how many different possible nitrogen bases are there?
5.
There you go. There are 5 possible nitrogen bases. And just for kicks, for starters, why don't we just go with the letters? What are the possible letters for them?
A, G, T, U, C.
Excellent. A, G, T, U, and C. And just out of curiosity, everybody know what the A stands for?
Adenine.
Yeah. Adenine. Excellent. Right? G is guanine, T is thymine, U is uracil, C is cytosine. Excellent. So we have these 5 possible bases. You take a base, you take a sugar, you take a phosphate, you put them together, and you have a nucleotide. Then you put these nucleotides together to make our nucleic acids. Now, we're not going to go too much in depth on this. We'll talk about this more when we talk about protein synthesis, when we talk about mitosis. So I'm going to cheat and just use blocks. But basically what happens is you take the sugar. Where's my drawing? There it is. And the phosphate. And then coming off of that, we have some type of base. So those 3 things are together. And what ends up happening is that our sugars and our phosphates bind together to form a backbone. So basically we have a sugar phosphate backbone. And then coming off of it, we then have all of the different bases, the A's, the T's, the C's, the G's, all of those things coming off of them in a row. And that gives us our information. And as we mentioned, and again, even though I just told you you can't abbreviate it, I'm going to abbreviate it in the interest of time. It gives us our DNA and our RNA. And what does this provide for us? What is DNA and RNA used for?
Genetic.
Everything.
I like that, everything. But didn't I say proteins are responsible for everything?
No.
I did. Proteins are the most important macromolecule we have, right? Our proteins determine whether you are left-handed or right-handed, whether you are tall or short, whether you have brown eyes or blue eyes, whether you have a predisposition for heart disease or don't have a predisposition for heart disease. However, what determines what proteins you make?
DNA.
Your DNA, exactly. Your DNA is are basically the instructions to make proteins. We have a fancy name for those instructions. What do we call them? I like roadmap. That's a good term, but what else do we call them?
Genes.
Genes, absolutely. Right? These are our genes. Of course, this DNA and these genes are very, very important, so we lock them up inside the cell and protect them. Where do we lock them up inside the cell?
Nucleus.
In the nucleus, absolutely. However, if we want to make these proteins, we need to get that information out into the cell itself. So that's where the RNA comes in. RNA is the temporary disposable copy of the gene that then can be used to make all those proteins. And so when we talk about dividing a cell, mitosis, we'll talk about our proteins. We'll talk about DNA again. We'll actually talk about the process in cells of making proteins, protein synthesis. We'll talk about this in much more depth then as well. But this is a good starting point for here. All right. Questions on that?
So if DNA controls the synthesis of protein, are proteins still the most important macromolecules?
Sure. Right. What good is the idea if you can't put that idea into form? Right. What makes you left-handed, what gives you your blood type are the proteins that are on the surface of your blood cells. Right? Your DNA has the information for how to make those proteins, but if you're not expressing those proteins, then you don't have blood type, or you don't have other conditions. So again, obviously all of it is needed. If you don't have the instructions, then you don't know how to make the protein. So obviously the instructions are vitally important, right? Anybody who's ever bought something from IKEA knows how important it is to have instructions, right? But you also have to have the pieces to make as well. So obviously it all works together. Yeah. Great question. Handedness is one of those tricky things because obviously there is a very strong genetic component to it. However, there is an equally strong societal component to it, right? Great example, my mother was born in Portugal. She moved over here to America when she was 9 years old. And my mom is left-handed. And when she was in school in Portugal and would try to write with her left hand, the nuns would slap her with a ruler because the left side of the hand, the left eye, the left side of the body, being left-handed is a sign of the devil. And so she was discouraged from being left-handed and had to use a right hand. Of course, when she got over here to America and started school here, nobody cared anymore. And so she could go back to using her left hand. So there is a very strong societal pressure on handedness. So that can influence it. And not only that, but when we think of someone being left-handed versus right-handed, there's also left-eyed versus right eye. We have a dominant eye, we have a dominant foot. We have a dominant leg, things along those lines. And not everybody is all one side or all the other. So there's a mix of that. So like most things we talk about in this class, a good general rule to remember about this class is in this class, the sky is blue, right? If you look outside right now, what color is the sky? Blue. Blue, absolutely. However, if we were doing this class at 6 o'clock in the morning, would it be blue outside? At night, is it blue outside? When it's raining, is it blue outside? At sunrise and sunset, is it blue outside? No. That doesn't mean that blue is a wrong answer. Blue is just a general answer that's right most of the time. It's a simple answer, all right? And that's what this class is about. In this class, the sky is blue. When you get to nursing school or medical school or graduate school, that's when you get to learn about when the sky is gray and the sky is orange and the sky is red. In this class, the sky is blue. So yeah, obviously handedness is one of those things that is far more complicated, but there is a very strong genetic component to it. All right, excellent. Questions on that? All right, one more very vitally important thing that you know about nucleic acids that you did not know you knew about nucleic acids. Because here what it is sometimes fun to do. We can take a nucleic acid, and we don't want to take any old nucleic acid. So again, let's go ahead and grab our 5-carbon sugar. Oops. And how many different sugars can we have here again? How many different sugars, if we're picking a nucleotide, how many different sugars can there be?
2.
2. So in this case, let's make it a ribose. To that ribose, we are going to add our nitrogen base. And we don't want it to be any old nitrogen base. So in this case, we'll make it the one that we already identified, adenine. And of course, we know our nucleotide is not done yet until we add a phosphate to it. And for this phosphate, we'll put a nice big fat P, and we'll remind ourselves that it is a very, very negative molecule. Now, this is our starting point, but because I'm feeling a little kooky, I may decide I want to add a second phosphate to this nucleotide. Now, here's the problem. As we know, phosphates are highly negative. And as we know from playing with magnets, are 2 negative things going to be easy to put together? No. So what happens is, to get them to come together, I'm going to need to use a lot of energy. I have to use a lot of energy to put them together. Of course, if I use a lot of energy to put that together, that also means it stores a lot of energy. And that's a little big. Let's make that a little smaller. But because I'm feeling particularly frisky today, I'm not going to stop with 1. I'm going to add a second. Whoops, nope, don't want to do that. I'm going to add a second phosphate onto the original one so that I have a total of 3. And again, notice with 2 phosphates, I have something very negative here. And if I want to add another negative thing on there, well, if it took a lot of energy the last time, then this time, to use the technical term, it's going to require lots and lots of energy to put these together. Of course, if I'm using lots and lots of energy to put them together, that also means it stores lots and lots of energy. And when I'm done with all of that work, what do I have as a result?
ATP.
There you go, which would be awesome, except we don't allow abbreviations. So you're absolutely correct. ATP is what we have made as a result of this here. But someone remind me again what ATP stands for?
Adenosine triphosphate.
There you go. Adenosine, which is basically adenine and the ribose together, triphosphate. And what is adenosine triphosphate? Oops.
It's what happens with some of the food that we eat when it gets, not all of it goes throughout our body, some of it gets stored.
Yeah, I like that. It's the energy molecule. of the cell. This is the energy molecule of the cell. This is how we do our work. We want to pump things out of the cell, bring things into the cell, move things around, metabolize, all these different things. ATP is the energy of the cell. Basically what happens is we take that ATP, and since I've written it out once, I can abbreviate it now. And what I do is I split off the phosphate. When I, oops, hold on. I wanted that to be pink. So what happens is I split the ATP. When that occurs, what happens is I release a tremendous amount of energy. And that energy is used to do work. And as a result of that, I now have a free floating phosphate. And what's the other molecule that I have?
ADP?
ADP. Of course, we're not going to get away with ADP on the exam. So someone remind me what ADP stands for?
Adenosine diphosphate.
Exactly. Oops, I did not right there. Phosphate. Excellent. And again, if I'm really desperate, I can actually break off that second phosphate as well, in which case my ADP, I split the ADP, and as a result of that, I release some energy. Obviously not nearly as much as I did the last time, and that energy can do work. And as a result of that, I get a phosphate, and what molecule am I left with?
Adenosine monophosphate.
Yeah, AMP, which you are absolutely correct, is adenosine monophosphate. Right. I'm sure pretty much everybody here in this class has heard of ATP before. But I'm willing to bet that not everybody in this class realized that ATP was a nucleotide, was an energy form of nucleic acids. We've all heard of ATP, we've all heard of DNA, we've all heard of RNA, but probably most of you didn't realize they're related to each other. And so that's why it's important to look at this. And again, if you don't like my drawing for this, we have this exact same thing in your textbook. So we did that, we did that, we did that. And here we see that adenosine monophosphate, diphosphate, and triphosphate from putting those molecules together. So obviously, nucleotides are used for our genetic information, the instructions to make protein, but we also use them as our cellular energy, the molecule we use to do work. All right. Questions on that?
I have a question. So
Yes.
let's say in the exam, if we have a answer that we have to fill in blank or something, and the answer is ATP or DNA, we can't write ATP. We have to write the full name.
So here's what I would say. On the lab exam is most important where spelling counts. On lab exam, I would definitely say write out adenosine triphosphate. If you just put ATP on the lab exam, I consider that a spelling error because there's no abbreviations. And so you would only get partial credit. You wouldn't get it wrong, but you'd get partial credit. Now, in an essay question, there's basically, the way I see it, there's two ways you can do it. When you're writing out your essay question, once you write out adenosine triphosphate once, then the rest of the time you can abbreviate it. Okay. Or if at the top or at the bottom you want to put key, ATP equals adenosine triphosphate, and then use ATP for the entire essay, that's fine as well. So as long as you write it out once on an essay question, you're welcome to abbreviate it after that. But obviously on a lab exam, you're only writing it out once. So write it out. Don't use abbreviations.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. Spelling matters. So no abbreviations. Excellent. Great question. Any others? And again, remember, I give you one letter. So if you spell adenosine and you put an I there instead of an E, or you transpose the O and the N, I give you one error like that, right? Or you forget to put the E at the end or something like that. I will give you one error, one missing letter, one changed letter, one transposed letter. But if your spelling is off more than that, then you will lose partial credit. Okay? Excellent. Great questions. Any others? All right. Well, the good news is that is actually all I have for today. We have completed the lecture part that I want to talk about. Before we break, there is one last thing that I do want to really talk about and emphasize. And for that, I want to go, let's see, where, do I have it still up? I want to talk a little bit about the lab and the lab exam, because again, that's coming up soon. Okay, so it's not there. So this will be the easiest way to do this. Perfect.
Why does it feel like yesterday there was a lot more people at the lecture?
Because there were still a lot of people trying to add. And I think what's happened is that fewer people have been able to add. And so I think people are looking elsewhere to try to add the class. So that would be my guess. Again, I added because I want to be able to try to get as many people in and I want people to be successful. Every single person on the wait list was able to get into the class. So the class had 30, 20 on the wait list. So 50 people were able to come. And obviously we've started to have some attrition since then. But the class usually enrolls around 30. We usually start with some around 32. So that's where I expect we'll eventually end up, somewhere in that range.
How many people in the semester?
3.
Oh my God.
I'm kidding. Obviously, every semester is different. This is only my second, well, I guess third semester counting summer, but summer doesn't really count. What I found last semester, and again, it's a one sample size, is there was a lot of attrition, but a lot of it also happened much later. Normally what happens in the classroom is we lose a lot at the beginning when they realize how much work it's going to be, but most of the people who think they can do it stick around. And then at the end, we lose a couple more. But I think maybe because it was online, I lost almost nobody at the beginning. And then right before the drop deadline, a huge chunk left. So my guess on average is, I think 25 was about right. Usually we lose, a little less than a third. So from 32 to 25 during the summer sounds about a typical normal, but I think it's a little bit crazier during the summer. We also have more turnover at the beginning of class. I've been able to add more students than I normally am able to in the classroom. I think just because not as everybody's as comfortable with this format.
I started
Right.
I started chemistry at 305 last semester, and then when we went online, we started off with like 40 people, and we ended off with 15.
Yeah, no, well, again, everybody was in crisis mode a year ago when we were transitioning, and none of it was productive. So yeah, we were all just basically flying by the seat of our pants, trying to survive. I think we were all in survival mode. All right, so one of the things that you need to get used to looking at, as I mentioned, is not just the models, not just the charts, the illustrations from your textbook, not just the illustrations from your textbook and your lab manual, things like that, but models and charts as well. One of the good ways to do that is to, again, as we talked about, take advantage of this CRC virtual anatomy lab. If you go to the CRC, this is Cosumnes River College, one of our sister colleges, has put together this site. I will tell you, ARC, we are in the process of doing this, but we have a lot more resources than they do. So we're a little behind them, but that doesn't mean we can't take advantage of theirs. If you go to their site, and here's the pop-up for it, so you go here, notice we're starting on Tuesday, going to start talking about cells. And lo and behold, they've got some great pictures here of the cells. This is a model that we have in our classroom that we normally study in the classroom, and I guarantee pictures of this model will be on the exam. So using your textbook, using your lab manual, you are going to be responsible for identifying every single thing in here. All right, so notice the nice thing about this site is it has these images, and then when you click on the slide, it then brings up the labels. So you can go back and forth and quiz and test yourself. And then they've got some electron microscopy images that can be identified. And again, what I will say is I have not made this site. I'm not responsible. Wow, they have a lot of electron microscopy. Is that the only model picture they have? Maybe. All right. Well, so this isn't the best thing ever, but at least they have the one picture here. So again, they have some of these things. So start familiarizing yourself with this. We will go over it together starting on Tuesday, but you want to start looking at these things and getting prepared ahead of time, right? Remember, as we talked about with those daily quizzes, they are either going to be specific information that we have already covered or general information about what we're going to cover. So I expect you, especially coming off of the 5-day weekend, coming into a Tuesday class, that's usually a good opportunity to make sure that you've been paying attention to the material and have one of those daily quizzes that we talked about, the 5 for 5 daily quizzes. So I'm not saying whether we will or not have one. I'm just saying that Mondays like that tend to be good days to have, or Tuesdays in this case, tend to be good days to have daily quizzes. So as always, it is important to be on time and to come to class prepared. All right. Take advantage of your resources, take advantage of your textbook, your online resources, all of those things as you study this weekend to be successful. As I mentioned, 1 week from today, today's Thursday, right? Yeah, 1 week from today, we will have our practice lab exam. No points, not even going to collect it and grade it. This is an opportunity for you to gauge how successful you're being studying. But what I will tell you is every single question on that practice lab exam is a question that has been on previous exams. So it is a very good indication of what you can expect from me on a lab exam.
For the practice lab exam, I know you said it's no points, but will you be telling us the answers, or will we be?
Yeah, no, that's the whole point of going through it. You will, okay. What we will do is we'll talk about it. You will then take it. We will then meet back up after you guys take it, and we will talk about it. So we will talk about it. I'm not just going to have you take it blind. And not only will I talk about it, but I will talk precisely about not only the questions and the answers themselves, but why I picked the particular, try to get in English, why I picked those particular questions to ask. There's reasons why all of them are on this quiz.
Okay.
Help to get you to be the smart, sophisticated students that you're going to need to be successful in this class. All right. Questions on any of that? All right, excellent. That is, as I mentioned then, all I have for today. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have a study guide for the cell because you are responsible for all of the organelles, all of the components of those organelles in the cell. Same way I didn't bother to make a study guide for the regional terms or directional terms because you need to know all of them. But when we get to tissues on the next exam, then you will start getting study guides for the lab material because there's just too much lab material there for you to be able to cover. So I want you to know precisely what you will be responsible for. Good. You should be having trouble with the difference between lab and lecture because there is no difference between lab and lecture. Lab and lecture are just different modalities for learning the material. If I'm describing to you the process of homeostasis, it makes more sense for me to stand up here and point to you and wave my hands and point to the board and do all of those things to make sense of it. If you're learning the bones, it makes more sense for you to work in groups where you hold the bones in your hand and you look at them, rather than me standing up here at the board saying, this is a femur, this is the head of the femur, right? That's not a good way to learn this. However, guess what we're going to be doing in this class? This is a femur. This is the head of the femur. The only good part about it is I won't be the one doing that. You will. You guys will be doing group presentations of the bones and bone features that way. But yeah, especially this part, there isn't much of a difference between lab and lecture. When we get to the bones, when we get to the muscles, when we get to those types of things, we will have more of a split. But even with the tissues and the skin, normally you would have microscopes that you'd be looking on and you'd be working on. And unfortunately, we don't have those. So it will be much, especially the first part of the class, first two parts of the class, will be much more lecture based. Eventually, we'll get into more lab stuff and more group stuff, but this format isn't conducive for it. But one of the things that I emphasize, even when we're in the classroom, is this is not two classes. There's not an anatomy lab and anatomy lecture. Those aren't two classes. This is one class. So all lab and lecture are different modalities for learning the material. You are responsible for all of the material on all of the exams. So it's all one bowl of knowledge. So we are going to treat it as such. Excellent. All right. Great question. Any others? Hey, did that kid have permission to look at around the corner of the screen? I see you. Alyssa, get him out of there. He hasn't paid for this class. Yeah. All right. Questions on any of that? All right, excellent. Okay, well, you guys have a good weekend. Study hard, and I will see you guys on Tuesday. Bye.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
one
you.
more.
Bye, thank you, Professor.
Bye.
You said
Yes.
you would tell like waitlisted people where they were on the.
So yes. So as I mentioned during the break, unfortunately, coming back from the break, I do not currently, despite my best efforts to scare people off, nobody has dropped yet. Everybody who was missing their prereqs was able to get it to me. So as of right now, I do not have a spot in the class for any waitlisted students. However, what I would encourage you to do is to continue to follow along. Don't buy the textbooks, don't buy the lab manuals, don't do any of those things yet, because I won't hold you responsible for those things until you're in the class. But at least, do the activities that are online, do those types of things if you can, and try to study if you can, and come back on Tuesday. And if anybody drops between now and Tuesday, I will add more students. So, but it'll happen at the beginning of the class on Tuesday. I will announce right at the beginning of class that I have no spots, I have 1 spot, I have 5 spots, whatever it is. And then I will add off the wait list from those people who are there on Tuesday in their wait list priority order. So I can't add anybody right now, but again, all the people that have been, like Amanda, you're already in, right? You I saw that. So yeah. So, but anybody else who's still on the wait list, come on Tuesday, and I'll be able to tell you right away. So, but if I'm not able to add anybody on Tuesday, that's as far out as I can go to before I add someone. So hopefully someone will get scared off over the weekend, and I'll be able to add more people on Tuesday. All right.
I hope so.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Excellent.
Are you teaching in the summer by chance for 430?
Yes, don't take 430 during the summer. It's a horrible, horrible class. So all kidding aside, it is a horrible class. If you've noticed, all the things I've talked about is how much time, how much effort it takes to learn this class. If you think about how exhausting what we've done this week is, we met Tuesday for 4.5 hours, then you got a whole day off. Then we came back Thursday, and now you're going to get 5 days off. So even though you're exhausted right now, you now have 5 days to process this information, make sense of it, and then come back fresh on Tuesday. During summer, you have 4.5 hours on Monday, and then turn around 4.5 hours on Tuesday. 1 day off, and then 4.5 hours on Thursday, and 4.5 hours on Friday. Saturday, Sunday, and then you're back at it again.
My gosh.
Getting the information twice as fast, and you have less than half the time to study it. And I can't speak for other classes, but in my class, we have less time. So what in this class we're doing in 5 exams, in summer we only do 4. The first exam in summer is the first 5 chapters. It's all of section 1 and all of section 2 put together. Then you have 2 weeks for the bones, 2 weeks for the muscles, 2 weeks for the nervous system, and you're done. And because it's 4 tests, I don't replace the lowest score with the final. So in the summer, all 4 exams count. So there's no room for error. There's no time for learning. There's no time to understand how to be successful. It is a horrible, terrible experience. And even if you're one of those people that are really good at cramming information and purging it onto an exam, you need this information for 431. I'm not just randomly pulling things out of a hat that you need to learn. The things you're learning, you're going to need for the second semester. And even people who are good at cramming and purging typically aren't able to retain that information. And if you can't retain that information, you're at a huge disadvantage in 431. So I fully appreciate that you're feeling the pressure of time. You want to get on to the next stage of your life. You want to get these last couple classes done. But man, I mean, I have students who get A's in summer, but far, far more struggle. Several of the students who are in this class failed summer and are backing at it again. And heck, I had a student one year who got an A in summer and ended up having to drop 431 because he didn't remember any of the material and he was struggling, and because he liked that immediacy of it, and but didn't retain any of it. So I literally spend the first hour of summer school telling the students not to take summer school. The only reason I teach it is because my kids like food. Otherwise, I wouldn't teach it. My entire academic career, undergraduate and graduate, I never took a summer school class ever. But like I said, my children want a roof over their head, so I teach summer school. But I don't think anybody should take it.
It's a very frustrating process because it just even comes down to your priority registration. I can't get this class like without being.
So here's the only thing that I would say on that. You are correct, but really what I find is that there's 2 big waves. Yes, when enrollment first starts, everything fills up. But especially with like 430 and 431, there is so much turnover on the rosters between this that by the time you get on so what is it, like the third of the way through the class, halfway through the class, that registration usually opens. You have a ton of people who are in chemistry classes expecting to be able to take 430, and they sign up for 430. And so when they sign up for 430, because they expect to be able to complete it, but then they don't pass their chemistry. And so either when their grades come out, they drop, or at the end of the break, as I start sending out the emails, they drop then as well. Amanda, you ended up like first or second on the wait list. Do you remember when you got on the wait list? You're muted.
Sorry, sometimes the space bar works, but not if you're in the chat room. I think I was 14th on the wait list when I started.
So during the first stage, and then you'd gotten up to the first place on the wait list by the time class started. So again, it's a pretty big turnover. So one of the things that I always tell students to do when they email me is check the wait list twice a day, every day, in the morning, in the afternoon, and a spot opens up and you can get on it. So you just have to really be diligent about getting on there. And then obviously you got on the wait list, but like I said, there's no way for me to know what's going to happen on Tuesday. The same way there was no way for me to know what happened today. There are plenty of semesters where 5 people don't show up or 2 people don't have their prerequisites. And then unfortunately, there's sometimes like today where everybody's here and everybody has all of their prerequisites. It could be the same thing Tuesday. We covered a lot of material. There's a lot of stuff that has to be done. There were a handful of people, and again, I haven't looked to see who's waitlisted and who's not waitlisted, but I saw there's a handful of people who didn't take the chemistry quiz. So there may be some people over the weekend who realize that, you know what, this is too much work, it's too overwhelming, and they bail. I could easily have 6 people drop. All right, that's what happened during the summer. During the summer, I was just churning through people. In fact, during the summer, and again, I think part of it was because it was the first time it was fully online. I went through the entire wait list just in the 2 weeks before summer school started. So the person who was last on the wait list was actually enrolled in the class by the time it came around, and I had a full wait list again. So there was a huge turnover. I'm guessing people are getting a little bit more comfortable with the online, so it's not quite as much turnover. But for a lot of people, this is the type of class that they've never taken before. And so the workload for this could be very intimidating. And so I would not be shocked if 6 people drop by Tuesday, but I would also not be shocked if nobody drops by Tuesday, because a lot of people like you really, really want the class. And there's just no way for me to know. You are welcome to email me every day to see, hey, has anybody dropped yet? And I can tell you yes or no, but I can't tell you whether or not you're going to be able to add or not, because I have to go by the priority on the wait list. I guess whoever's first on the wait list would be, what that is. So yeah. So I mean, there's just no way for me to know.
You said earlier in the class that the wait list had like moved up, like that some people had moved up.
Yeah. So like today's a perfect example. There were. Last class, there were 3 people on the wait list who didn't show up. They all lost their priority. Today, there were 3 people on the wait list who didn't show up. They've lost their priority. So it looks like I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Looks like I have 9 people still on the wait list. So, yeah, there's no way for me to know how many people will get scared off. And again, if the person who's first on the wait list who isn't here right now, doesn't show up on Tuesday, then that person would lose their priority, and then whoever second would be added. So like I said, there's no way for me to really know until we see who drops and who shows up on Tuesday.
Okay.
So I wish you all luck. I want you guys in my class, but it's ultimately not up to me. We'll see what happens. Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I did a meeting with you, the 5 for 5, and you still didn't put it in. Are you gonna? I don't know if you like accidentally didn't.
No. Great question. I have my official grade book on my computer, not on Canvas. So because I've been constantly changing it and adding it as I've been having all the times booked, I haven't updated all of them. After the first day, I was able to get those up, but I haven't caught up since then. So since I have you here, I can actually tell you right now, just to confirm that it is indeed in there. But I imagine it is. Yeah, I've got it marked. I just haven't had a chance to input it yet. So my guess is that I won't input them till this weekend. This weekend, they'll get input. So by Tuesday, if you don't see the 5 points, then let me know. Otherwise, expect it to be there. Thank you for asking.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, guys. Have a good weekend. Bye.